History sometimes hinges not on what happened, but on what almost happened. In December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched an airstrike against the American Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. Aircraft dropped bombs weighing over 500 pounds, and torpedoes carrying explosive charges capable of tearing open battleship hulls several inches thick. In a few hours, battleships displacing more than 30,000 tons burned or sank. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed, and more than 2,000 American servicemen were killed. The strike fractured any remaining political hesitation in Washington. Within days, the United States declared war and began mobilizing an industrial machine capable of producing tens of thousands of aircraft, tanks weighing over 30 tons, and ships displacing thousands of tons each year. But imagine the moment before those aircraft lifted from their carriers. Japan in 1941 already faced a tightening noose. American embargoes restricted oil exports essential for aircraft, tanks, and naval vessels. Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil from abroad. Without those shipments, the Navy's ships consuming hundreds of gallons of fuel per hour would eventually stall in harbor. Aircraft engines burning aviation gasoline, measured in dozens of gallons per sortie, would fall silent. Strategic planners in Tokyo calculated their reserves carefully. Some estimates suggested Japan possessed fuel stocks sufficient for roughly 18 months of major operations. Without Pearl Harbor, the entire war in the Pacific shifts. Japan still required resources from Southeast Asia, oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, rubber plantations in Malaya, and mineral reserves across territories controlled by European colonial powers, weakened by Germany's war in Europe. Those resources promised barrels of oil measured in the millions annually. But reaching them meant launching military operations across thousands of miles of ocean. Inside the engine room of a Japanese aircraft carrier, preparing for operations in 1941, engineers monitored gauges measuring fuel consumption and boiler pressure. A carrier displacing over 20,000 tons required precise coordination of fuel flow to maintain speed across open ocean. Every operation, every aircraft launched, consumed additional reserves measured in gallons. If Japan had bypassed Pearl Harbor and instead moved directly south, attacking British and Dutch colonies without striking the United States first, the diplomatic and military consequences might have shifted dramatically. The United States might still have entered the war eventually, but not necessarily with the immediate unity that followed the destruction of battleships in Hawaii. American public opinion in 1941 remained divided over entering another global conflict. Industrial mobilization had begun, but had not yet reached full wartime output. Shipyards had not yet launched the thousands of vessels that would later carry armies across oceans. Aircraft factories had not yet reached production levels measured in hundreds of planes per week. I remember reading congressional debates from late 1941 and noticing how contested the question of war still appeared before the attack. The numbers discussed, military budgets measured in billions, ship construction measured in hundreds of hulls, were projections rather than certainties. The attack on Pearl Harbor collapsed those debates overnight. Without that attack, Japan might have advanced into Southeast Asia, while the United States remained officially neutral, at least temporarily. Japanese armies, supported by tanks weighing around 15 tons and aircraft carrying bombs weighing several hundred pounds, could have seized oil fields and ports before American forces mobilized fully. Imagine a Japanese transport convoy moving toward the Dutch East Indies without the simultaneous strike on Hawaii. Ships carrying troops and equipment measured in thousands of tons cross warm tropical waters, while destroyers patrol the perimeter, scanning for submarines. Aircraft circle overhead, searching for reconnaissance planes that might expose the operation. Meanwhile, American naval forces at Pearl Harbor remain intact. Battleships with armor plates more than 10 inches thick remain anchored but operational. Aircraft carriers remain free to patrol across the Pacific, rather than rushing into emergency response. Fuel depots storing millions of gallons remain untouched. The Pacific Fleet would still exist as a deterrent capable of projecting power if political conditions shifted toward war. Yet Japanese planners feared exactly that scenario. Their calculations suggested that if the United States remained unscathed at the opening of a southern campaign, American naval forces might interfere with Japanese supply lines, stretching across thousands of miles of ocean. Oil tankers, carrying hundreds of thousands of barrels, might become targets. Aircraft carriers could strike bases supporting Japanese expansion. So the decision hardened. Fracture the American fleet first, then seize the resources necessary to sustain the empire. Without Pearl Harbor, Japan might still have gained early victories in Southeast Asia. British colonial forces were thinly spread. Dutch defenses in Indonesia lacked the manpower to resist prolonged assault. Japanese aircraft operating from forward airfields could have dominated regional skies for a time, but the industrial balance remained unchanged. The United States possessed shipyards capable of launching vessels faster than most nations could sink them. Aircraft factories in California, Texas, and Michigan eventually produced planes in quantities exceeding 100,000 annually. Steel production, measured in tens of millions of tons per year, supplied tanks, ships, and artillery across multiple fronts. Even without the shock of Pearl Harbor, that industrial weight would still exist. The timeline of American entry into the war might stretch months or even years, but once engaged, American industry could outproduce Japan in ships, aircraft, and ammunition. Oil reserves in the United States dwarfed those available to Japan. Fuel supplies, measured in billions of gallons, supported fleets and air forces that could operate continuously. When I think about this scenario, I often picture two clocks ticking simultaneously. One measures political hesitation inside Washington. The other measures oil reserves inside Japanese storage tanks. Both move forward regardless of speeches or diplomacy. Inside a Japanese Zero fighter, preparing for takeoff from a carrier deck somewhere in the Pacific, the pilot grips the control stick while the engine roars at full throttle. The aircraft carries machine guns and perhaps bombs weighing a few hundred pounds. It is light, maneuverable, and deadly in skilled hands. Yet it also relies on fuel, refined from oil fields far from Japan's home islands. Eventually, the arithmetic returns. If you are listening now as the room grows quiet and the day drifts towards sleep, imagine that alternate December morning, where the carriers never launched their strike aircraft toward Hawaii. The Pacific remains calm. Battleships rest in harbor. Somewhere across the ocean, planners still stare at maps filled with arrows pointing south. This is the entire history of what might have happened if Japan never attacked Pearl Harbor. Chapter 1. The Man Who Almost Stopped It. The 7th of January, 1941, the combined fleet's flagship, the battleship Nagato, sits at anchor in Hiroshima Bay. The water is flat and gray. Below decks, in a narrow officer's cabin barely wide enough to turn around in, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto is finishing a letter. He writes in a precise, architectural hand. He doesn't rush. The letter is addressed to Navy Minister Koshiro Oikawa, and it lays out, in careful institutional language, a proposal that the rest of the Japanese Naval General Staff considers somewhere between brilliant and suicidal. Yamamoto proposes to send Japan's entire carrier force across nearly 4,000 kilometers of open Pacific Ocean and destroy the American fleet at anchor in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The ink is barely dry before the arguments begin. What strikes me about this moment, and I've come back to it many times, is how easily it could have gone the other way. The Pearl Harbor attack was not a product of Japanese national strategic doctrine. It wasn't in the war plans. It wasn't the default option. For most of the 14 months between January and December of 1941, the Japanese Naval General Staff actively resisted Yamamoto's proposal and argued for an entirely different strategy. The standard doctrine, the one the Navy had spent 30 years building its fleet to execute, was called Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle. Under this plan, the American Pacific Fleet would be drawn westward across the Central Pacific, worn down by submarine and air attacks along the way, and finally destroyed in a set-piece gun battle somewhere near Japan's mandated island chain. It was a doctrine built on a specific geography, a specific enemy movement, and 3 decades of weapons procurement. Yamamoto's Pearl Harbor proposal effectively declared all of that irrelevant. The resistance to Yamamoto's plan was not timidity. Rear Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the very officer Yamamoto commissioned to assess the plan's feasibility, concluded initially that the operation was too likely to fail catastrophically if even one carrier was lost during the attack. The Naval War College's tabletop simulation, conducted in the autumn of 1941, produced a result showing 2 Japanese fleet carriers sunk in the Pearl Harbor attack. The simulation referees adjusted that result. The adjusted figure, 0 carrier losses, was the one the Naval General Staff eventually accepted as the basis for planning approval. When I first encountered that detail in the secondary literature, I had to read it twice. Japan's highest military planning authority approved the most audacious naval operation of the 20th century, partly on the basis of a war game result that had been formally corrected by its own referee. What broke the institutional resistance was not better arguments, it was a threat. Sometime in the autumn of 1941, the exact date is not pinned down precisely in the surviving records, Yamamoto told his staff that if the Pearl Harbor operation was not approved, he would resign his command and take his senior staff with him. The Naval General Staff, according to Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome's post-war account, believed the threat was genuine. Yamamoto was the most popular officer in the fleet. Replacing him on the eve of a potential war would have been, at minimum, a public relations catastrophe. Admiral Osami Nagano and the Naval General Staff eventually relented. They approved the attack. But Fukudome's account is worth weighing against another version. Combined Fleet Staff Officer Kameto Kuroshima later suggested Yamamoto's resignation threat was a calculated gambit rather than genuine intent. These two readings, sincere versus strategic, have quite different implications. If Yamamoto was genuinely prepared to resign, then his plan was also genuinely personal, almost obsessive. If it was a negotiating tactic, the institutional calculus was more cynical and the outcome more contingent. I find myself drawn to Fukudome's account, not because it's more dramatic, but because Yamamoto's subsequent private correspondence suggests a man who had already made his peace with catastrophic outcomes. The alternative to Yamamoto's plan, the Kantai-Kessen Doctrine, deserves more attention than it usually receives, because understanding it changes everything about the alternate history. The entire surface fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been optimized for one specific fight. Japan's Type 93 torpedo, known later as the Long Lance, was the finest surface-launched torpedo in the world in 1941, a weapon with a range of roughly 40,000 meters at 36 knots, carrying a warhead of approximately 490 kilograms. It was designed specifically for the nighttime attrition phase of the decisive battle doctrine, the stage where destroyers and cruisers would cut the flanks off an American battle line in darkness. It was not designed for harbor attacks. In a very real technical sense, the Long Lance and the Pearl Harbor plan were mutually exclusive strategic philosophies. Yamamoto's carrier-centric vision required a different navy from the one Japan had built, and the Navy knew it. Approving his plan meant, quietly, acknowledging that 30 years of doctrine had been wrong. There's another detail buried in the planning records that I want to sit with for a moment, because it reframes what we mean by inevitable. The Tripartite Pact, the alliance signed in September of 1940, bound Germany, Italy, and Japan together in mutual defense. But the pact's terms were defensive in character. Germany was only obligated to support Japan if Japan were attacked by a third party. Japan, as the aggressor at Pearl Harbor, did not technically qualify for German assistance under the pact's terms. This matters in an almost vertiginous way. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States on the 11th of December, 1941, the act that formally joined the Pacific and European wars into a single global conflict, was not legally required of him. He made it voluntarily. It was his own decision, born of his own ideological convictions and his enthusiasm for Japan's surprise attack as a model of decisive action. Pull the thread of Pearl Harbor, and that voluntary act disappears entirely from history. The two wars, European and Pacific, remain legally and strategically separate. The Good War, as we understand it, the unified Allied coalition, Germany first, the combined Anglo-American effort, depends on a chain of contingencies that all begin with one admiral writing a letter in a narrow cabin in Hiroshima Bay. What Yamamoto couldn't have known, what none of the planning officers in Tokyo could have fully grasped, was that the fuel tank farm at Pearl Harbor, containing approximately 4.5 million barrels of oil in January of 1941, would still be standing after the attack. The attack they were planning, and eventually executing, would miss it entirely. The battleships would burn, the aircraft would burn, and the fuel that kept the entire Pacific Fleet operational would sit largely untouched, a few hundred meters from the most spectacular naval destruction in history. In our alternate timeline, that fuel farm is simply not a military target, because there is no attack. It sits in the Hawaiian sun, month after month, full and uneventful. But the knowledge that the actual attack left it standing is a useful corrective to the idea that what happened on the 7th of December, 1941, was a cleanly executed strategic masterpiece. It was a partial success, executed under enormous pressure, by a man who had threatened to resign to get it approved, against the advice of his own war college's simulation. It was, in a word someone wrote in pencil on a carbon copy of the proposal and then half erased, reckless. The question this chapter leaves open is one I want to carry carefully through the rest of this story. If Yamamoto's plan had been rejected, if the Naval General Staff had called his bluff, accepted his resignation, and reverted to Kantai-Kessen, what would Japan actually have done about the problem that was driving all of these decisions? Because the oil clock was already running. By September of 1941, Japan's total petroleum reserve had dropped to roughly 50 million barrels. The Imperial Japanese Navy alone was burning approximately 2,900 barrels every single hour. The plan that the Naval General Staff was arguing about was not really about Pearl Harbor at all. It was about time. And time, in the autumn of 1941, was the one resource Japan couldn't negotiate for. The Nagato would remain at anchor for several more months. Yamamoto's letter made its way through the bureaucracy, accumulated endorsements and objections, crossed and recrossed the desks of men who disagreed with each other and couldn't say so publicly. Somewhere in the Naval War College archive in Tokyo, the carbon copy of that letter still exists, with the half-erased pencil mark in the upper corner. The word for reckless, written by an unknown hand, doubted, and then incompletely removed. Not struck through, not corrected, just softened. As if whoever wrote it knew they were right, but wasn't quite willing to leave the evidence. Chapter 2. The Oil Clock. By the summer of 1941, someone in Tokyo was watching a number and revising it downward. In a document classified at the highest level available to the Japanese cabinet, a planning board assessment that circulated through the government's inner economic councils, an analyst had written an estimate for Japan's remaining viable oil reserve, calculated against projected wartime consumption. The original estimate on page 7 of the document read 24 months. That figure was crossed out. Below it, in what appears to be a different hand and certainly a heavier pen pressure, someone wrote 18 months, then underlined it twice. The correction was dated in early August of 1941. Whoever made it wasn't panicking, they were just being accurate, and the accuracy was damning. To understand why Japan went to war in December of 1941, you have to understand that the decision was made, at its foundation, not by admirals or prime ministers, but by accountants. Japan's entire military-industrial civilization ran on imported oil. In 1941, Japan's total annual oil consumption, civilian and military combined, had climbed from roughly 21 million barrels per year a decade earlier to more than 32 million barrels. The Navy alone was burning fuel at a rate that made the reserves visibly shrink from one quarterly report to the next. There was almost no domestic production to speak of. Japan sat on negligible oil deposits. The country had modernized its military and partially mechanized its economy on fuel sourced almost entirely from abroad, primarily from the United States, which supplied roughly 80% of Japan's aviation gasoline, and from the Dutch East Indies, which supplied most of the rest. It was an extraordinary structural dependency, and in the summer of 1941, it was cut off. The mechanism of the cutoff is more complicated than it's usually described, and the complications matter for the alternate history. On the 26th of July, 1941, President Roosevelt signed an executive order freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. The immediate cause was Japan's advance into southern French Indochina, which threatened British Malaya and Dutch colonial possessions, and made a southward Japanese military push essentially undeniable. Roosevelt's order was, strictly speaking, an asset freeze, not an explicit oil embargo. He had, according to the documentary record, intended to allow some oil licenses to continue, specifically for lower-grade fuels, as a way of keeping a diplomatic thread open. What actually happened is that Treasury officials, most significantly Dean Acheson, who was managing the Foreign Funds Control Committee, simply declined to process any Japanese oil license applications. No licenses were approved, no oil moved. The pipeline went to zero not because Roosevelt ordered a total embargo, but because the men implementing the partial embargo implemented a total one instead. By the time the State Department recognized the discrepancy, weeks had passed, and the political cost of reversing it was considered prohibitive. The decision that cornered Japan was, in significant part, an administrative error that no one was willing to own. By September of 1941, Japan's reserve had dropped to approximately 50 million barrels. The Imperial Japanese Navy, according to logistics records examined in a 1941 U.S. Army War College study, drawing on Japanese planning documents, was consuming approximately 2,900 barrels of oil every single hour. Run those numbers quietly, and they become vertiginous. At that burn rate, the Navy alone consumed just under 70,000 barrels per day. The 50 million barrel reserve, in pure Navy consumption terms, represented roughly 718 days of operation, slightly under 2 years. But that assumes wartime operations, and wartime consumption is higher than peacetime. The Japanese Army had its own separate reserves and separate consumption. The Cabinet Planning Board's revised 18-month figure was not alarmist. It was probably optimistic. When I was cross-referencing the Army's consumption projections with the Navy's separate fuel accounting records, I found it genuinely striking how little coordination there was between the two services on reserve calculations. They were each watching the same clock from different rooms and arriving at slightly different times. The Dutch East Indies represented the only meaningful alternative supply. Japan imported roughly 25% of its annual oil from the Dutch colonial holdings, primarily from the fields around Tarakan and Balikpapan in Borneo, and from the massive Palembang complex in Sumatra. After the American asset freeze, Japanese negotiators approached the Dutch colonial government in Batavia and proposed significantly expanded purchase agreements. The Dutch stalled. Their position was diplomatically untenable. The Netherlands was occupied by Germany, making the colonial government in Batavia technically an exile administration, answering to a government in exile in London. But they were stalling deliberately. They had no intention of fueling Japan's expansion, regardless of the commercial terms offered. In June of 1941, the Dutch East Indies produced approximately 8 million tons of oil per year, by one contemporary estimate. Japan's minimum military requirement was roughly 5 million tons annually. The arithmetic suggested supply was possible. The politics made it impossible. The Dutch would neither formally refuse nor actually supply, stringing the negotiations out through the summer while making no binding commitments. There's a technical detail about the Dutch oil that almost never appears in the strategic histories, but that changes the picture considerably. The crude oil extracted from the Tarakan fields in northern Borneo has a higher paraffin content than the California crude Japan had been importing from American suppliers. This sounds like a chemistry footnote. It isn't. The paraffin content of Tarakan crude causes wax deposits in the fuel lines and boiler systems of destroyer-class warships operating at sustained high speed. Japanese Navy Engineering Division reports from 1940 noted this problem and flagged it as a maintenance concern. The practical effect was a degradation of sustained fleet speed. Operational estimates suggested a reduction of roughly 2 to 4 knots in destroyer screens running on unadjusted Tarakan fuel. In a Navy whose tactical doctrine depended on high-speed night engagements and torpedo runs, that degradation was strategically meaningful. Japan couldn't simply replace American oil with Dutch oil and expect the same fleet performance. Every barrel was not equal. I want to be honest about what this chapter is really arguing, because it's easy to get lost in the fuel calculations. The oil crisis is sometimes presented as the single cause of Japan's decision for war, as if the embargo made conflict inevitable, and every subsequent decision was merely execution. That's too clean. Historian Akira Irie has argued that Japan had meaningful diplomatic paths available in late 1941 that it failed to fully pursue, that the China War could theoretically have been wound down, or at least paused, in ways that might have generated enough American diplomatic goodwill to ease the oil situation. Jonathan Utley's counter-argument, that the embargo's implementation was so bureaucratically entangled that no amount of Japanese diplomatic initiative could have quickly reversed it, is grimly persuasive. The Atchison-controlled licensing committee wasn't going to release oil licenses because of a Japanese diplomatic initiative. The institutional machinery had set itself on a course. To me, the most revealing detail isn't the 50 million barrel figure or the 2,900 barrel burn rate. It's the pencil correction on page 7 of the Cabinet Planning Board document. 24 months crossed out, 18 months underlined twice. Someone in a Tokyo office building understood, in August of 1941, that Japan was running out of time, and all the diplomacy in the world was not going to change the math. Japan's synthetic fuel program offers a final, bleak data point. The Fuel Society of Japan had been running a coal liquefaction program since 1937, an attempt to create petroleum substitutes from Japan's considerable coal deposits. By 1941, this program was producing approximately 1.8 million barrels of synthetic fuel per year. Against Japan's total annual consumption of more than 32 million barrels, this represented roughly 5.5% of national requirements. Every Japanese planner who looked at those figures knew what they meant. Synthetic fuel was not a solution. It was a margin note. The coal liquefaction program continued through the war and never came close to solving the underlying problem. It was, like so many of Japan's strategic responses in 1941, a genuine effort that was comprehensively inadequate to the scale of the challenge it was meant to address. The oil clock was the context within which every other decision in this story was made. Strip it away, and the alternate history becomes naively optimistic. Keep it in, and you understand why even the most reasonable diplomatic minds in Tokyo, in the autumn of 1941, felt the walls pressing in. The American first-quarter export figure for 1941, released before Washington classified the data, was 4,672,000 barrels, a single quarter. That number, once it disappeared from the record, left a hole in Japan's planning that no amount of Dutch negotiation or synthetic production could fill. The alternative to war wasn't peace. It was a slower, quieter version of the same crisis, arriving at the same destination by a different road. Chapter 3. Roosevelt's Trap, or Roosevelt's Dilemma? The 26th of July, 1941, in Washington. Not on the floor of Congress, not in a press conference, not in any public statement at all. In the quiet machinery of executive order and Treasury regulation. A presidential signature on a document freezing Japanese assets. No declaration, no formal confrontation. The American public woke up the following morning to headlines that described a diplomatic escalation, not a crisis. Roosevelt, by July of 1941, had been managing two incompatible political realities simultaneously for more than 2 years. His country was, by any meaningful measure, already in the European war on Britain's side, and a substantial majority of the American public did not want to formally enter it. The asset freeze was the culmination of a sanctions strategy that had been incrementally tightening since 1940, each step calculated to pressure Japan without triggering the confrontation Roosevelt didn't yet have the political cover to handle. What he got instead was a confrontation he hadn't fully intended, implemented by subordinates who were, in some cases, considerably more willing to accept the confrontation than he was. The historiographical debate about Roosevelt's foreknowledge of Pearl Harbor is one of those areas where the evidence is genuinely contested, and the political stakes have kept the arguments hot for more than 80 years. Robert Stinnett, in his year 2000 book, Day of Deceit, argued that Roosevelt had advanced knowledge of the Japanese strike through intercepted radio intelligence and deliberately withheld it, that Pearl Harbor was engineered to provide the political pretext for war that Roosevelt couldn't otherwise obtain. Historian David Kahn responded in the Journal of Military History with a point-by-point evidentiary rebuttal that dismantled Stinnett's source analysis systematically. The distinction between the two positions matters enormously for this story. If Stinnett was right, then Roosevelt needed Pearl Harbor, needed the outrage, needed the unity, needed the attack's moral clarity to break the isolationist dam. In that reading, the alternate history where Pearl Harbor doesn't happen is a Roosevelt who is trapped by his own success. He has maneuvered his country to the edge of war and cannot quite push it over. If Kahn's rebuttal holds, and the majority of working historians find it more persuasive, then Pearl Harbor was a genuine intelligence failure. The attack genuinely surprised the administration, and Roosevelt's policy had been, at bottom, a high-stakes gamble that Japan would fold under economic pressure, rather than reach for a military solution. The man who may have been most confident Japan would fold was Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Secretary of the Treasury, whose department bore direct responsibility for implementing the asset freeze. Morgenthau kept a diary of extraordinary detail throughout his years in office, its volumes now held at the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library. His entries from the summer and autumn of 1941 reflect a man who genuinely believed that Japan's economic dependence on American trade made military confrontation irrational from the Japanese perspective. He and Dean Acheson had both been pushing for punitive economic measures against Japan for years, frustrated by what they saw as the State Department's excessive caution. When the asset freeze order came, it was Acheson's committee that processed, or rather declined to process, the oil license applications. Acheson and Morgenthau had taken advantage of the freeze order's ambiguous language to implement the total embargo they had both long wanted. The State Department's attempt to walk this back found the bureaucratic path closed. The oil licenses simply stopped flowing. By the time anyone at the senior level recognized that the partial embargo had become a total one, the institutional momentum had outrun the policy intention. The Magic Signals Intelligence Program complicates the foreknowledge question further. By late 1941, American cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese purple diplomatic cipher and were reading the communications between the Japanese Foreign Ministry and its embassies in real time. This was a significant intelligence achievement, but it was also, critically, only a diplomatic intelligence capability. The purple cipher carried foreign ministry traffic, ambassadorial messages, negotiating positions, instructions to Nomura and Kurusu. It did not carry operational naval traffic. The Japanese Navy communicated on separate codes, primarily what analysts designated JN-25, and JN-25 was only partially broken by December of 1941. American signals intelligence in late 1941 could read what Japan's diplomats were saying, but could not read what Japan's Navy was doing. The intelligence picture was genuinely incomplete, not deliberately withheld. Roosevelt and his senior advisors knew Japan was probably going to attack somewhere in Southeast Asia. They didn't know it was going to attack Pearl Harbor. The geographical specification in the November 27th war warning telegram, which cited the Philippines, Thailand, and the Kra Peninsula as the anticipated targets, was not misdirection. It was an accurate reflection of what the intelligence picture actually showed. The whole note of November 26, 1941, is the document at the center of every serious alternate history of this period, because it is the document that closed the last negotiating window. Secretary of State Cordell Hull presented it to Japanese ambassadors Nomura and Kurusu as a statement of American terms. It required Japan to withdraw its military forces not only from French Indochina, the immediate cause of the sanctions, but from all of China. Japan had been fighting in China since 1937. Withdrawing from China entirely meant abandoning a campaign that had already cost Japan roughly 185,000 military lives and a decade of national investment. Japanese Prime Minister Tojo Hideki told his cabinet it was an ultimatum. Hull's memoirs describe it as a comprehensive peace proposal. Both of them were describing the same document. The gap between those two descriptions is not a disagreement about facts. It's a disagreement about the entire framework within which diplomacy between the two countries was possible. What Hull almost sent instead matters enormously. He had drafted a temporary agreement, a modus vivendi in diplomatic terminology, that proposed a 90-day truce. Japan would halt its southern advance. The United States would partially ease the oil embargo and resume some commercial relations. It wasn't a peace settlement, it was a pause, a 90-day reprieve to allow both governments to reassess their positions. Roosevelt had seen the draft and initially approved it. Then, in the final days of November, came pressure from Chiang Kai-shek's government in Chongqing, which feared a temporary American accommodation with Japan would weaken Chinese resistance. Came pressure from Churchill in London, who worried a deal would signal American weakness to the Axis, and Hull himself, who was by then deeply skeptical that Japan was negotiating in good faith at all, withdrew the modus vivendi on November 25th and replaced it with the comprehensive note the following day. The 90-day pause never arrived. In the archives of American diplomatic history, it survives as a draft that was approved by the president and never sent, a document whose non-dispatch may have been, in operational terms, among the most consequential acts of omission in the entire war. There is one additional detail about the Hull note that the official histories tend to minimize. The note wasn't primarily drafted by Hull. Its final form was substantially shaped by Harry Dexter White, a senior Treasury economist who was simultaneously one of the most influential economic policy minds in the administration and, as later investigations determined, a source for Soviet intelligence. Whether White's authorship of the note's hard line was a product of Soviet interests, who had every reason to want the United States eventually drawn into the Pacific War, diverting Japanese attention from the Soviet Far East, or simply reflected his own long-standing hardline convictions about Japan, is a question the historical record doesn't clearly resolve. I'm not suggesting conspiracy. I am noting that the document which slammed the diplomatic door on Japan in November of 1941 was written by a man whose loyalties were, in retrospect, more complicated than anyone in the Roosevelt administration knew at the time. By the end of November 1941, the machinery of war had moved well ahead of the machinery of diplomacy. The asset freeze had been implemented, the oil was stopped, the Hull note had been delivered. The Japanese carrier strike force had already left port. The policy that had been intended to pressure Japan into retreat had instead set a trajectory that men on both sides were no longer sure how to redirect. Roosevelt, for his part, was managing three simultaneous crises: the Atlantic Naval War, the Japanese situation, and the domestic political constraint of 800,000 America First members and a Congress that had not voted to go to war. Whatever he intended when he signed the asset freeze order on the 26th of July, the outcome he got was not precisely the outcome he planned for. The gap between intention and consequence in the diplomatic record of 1941 is larger than any single actor's choices can account for. That gap is where the alternate history breathes. Chapter 4. The Letter That Never Came. He arrived in Washington on the 17th of November, 1941, having flown from Japan on the Pan American Clipper, a remarkable journey for a wartime envoy, covering thousands of miles of open Pacific in a commercial flying boat, touching down at Wake Island, at Midway, at Honolulu, at San Francisco, before the final leg to the American capital. His name was Saburo Kurusu. He was Japan's special envoy, dispatched to assist Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura in what both men understood were the final diplomatic negotiations before something irreversible happened. Kurusu had an American wife, Alice Little, from Indiana, and had spent enough time in the United States to understand American political culture in a way that most Japanese officials did not. He had also, 3 years earlier, been the Japanese diplomat who signed the Tripartite Pact in Berlin. It was one of the ironies of 1941 that the man most qualified to prevent a war with America was the man whose signature was on the document that made it more likely. Kurusu arrived with instructions from Tokyo to pursue what the Japanese Foreign Ministry called Plan B, a proposal for a temporary, limited accommodation that would have partially eased tensions without requiring any fundamental resolution of the China question. Under Plan B, Japan would halt its advance into southern Indochina and limit its forces there in exchange for the resumption of commercial oil supplies and some normalization of trade relations. It was not a settlement. Tokyo wasn't offering a settlement. Plan B was a 90-day pause, an attempt to stop the clock long enough for both governments to recalculate. Kurusu, according to his communications to Tokyo during this period, genuinely believed that the American side was not yet irreversibly committed to war, and that with careful handling, Plan B might be acceptable. His reading of Secretary of State Hull was that Hull was cautious, tired, and not entirely without pragmatism. On the 18th of November, Kurusu and Nomura met with Hull for 2 hours and 45 minutes. In his official account of that meeting, sent to Tokyo by cable, Kurusu described the Americans as not yet resolved. Hull had, at that moment, something on his desk that Kurusu didn't know about. A draft modus vivendi, a temporary agreement crafted within the State Department that bore a close resemblance to Japan's Plan B. The American draft proposed a 90-day arrangement. Japan would halt its military expansion in Southeast Asia. The United States would partially ease the oil embargo, allowing perhaps 1 million barrels per month of low-grade petroleum products to flow. Both sides would continue talking. Roosevelt had seen it and had not rejected it. Hull was uncertain. The British weren't enthusiastic. Chiang Kai-shek sent a frantic message from Chongqing, warning that any accommodation would demoralize Chinese resistance. Churchill, in a cable to Roosevelt, expressed his own reservations about a settlement that might appear to reward Japanese aggression. And Hull, who had been negotiating with the Japanese for the better part of a year, and who had developed a profound personal skepticism about their government's intentions, made his decision. On November 25th, he withdrew the modus vivendi from consideration. On November 26th, he handed Nomura and Kurusu the document that became known as the Hull Note. I want to linger on the geography of that Tuesday afternoon for a moment, because it captures something important about how close the other history was. On November 26, 1941, a Pan-American clipper was somewhere over the Pacific on a routine commercial flight, following exactly the same route Kurusu had taken to Washington 9 days earlier. That same clipper route would continue operating for another 11 days, all the way to December 6th. The passengers on those flights were crossing the same stretch of ocean where, in actual history, a Japanese carrier task force of 6 fleet carriers and 23 supporting vessels was sailing in radio silence toward Hawaii. Commercial aviation and a carrier strike force shared the same ocean in the same week, separated by a few hundred kilometers of gray water and a diplomatic note that had just been handed over in Washington. The clipper flights and the carrier force were operating in the same reality simultaneously, representing 2 entirely different versions of the future. One of them was about to eliminate the other. When Nomura and Kurusu read the Hull Note, the full American document, with its demand for complete Japanese withdrawal from all of China, Nomura, according to the account of the meeting preserved in Japanese diplomatic records, sat for a long moment without speaking. He had been in Washington for 11 months. He had conducted these negotiations with the genuine belief that a settlement was possible, even as his own government's military timetable was moving ahead of his diplomacy. Kurusu's response, by the account of what was communicated back to Tokyo in his cables, was that the note was unacceptable as written, but that it might still represent a negotiating position rather than a final American demand. Tokyo did not share his interpretation. The Japanese government received the Hull Note on November 27th, and, in the cabinet discussion that followed, Prime Minister Tojo described it as an ultimatum. Plans that had been held in a kind of strategic suspension, approved in principle but not yet irreversibly committed, moved toward execution. The question I keep returning to is not whether the modus vivendi would have held. 90 days of pause was 90 days. It was never going to resolve the China question or alter the oil embargo's structural logic. The question is what 90 days might have changed in the surrounding environment. In December of 1941, Germany was beginning its catastrophic reversal outside Moscow. Soviet counteroffensive pressure was already building. The Eastern Front's balance was shifting in ways that would have been more visible to Tokyo in February of 1942 than in December of 1941. A Japan that had not attacked Pearl Harbor in December would have been watching, in February, as the German army's autumn momentum disintegrated in the Russian winter. The strategic context within which Tokyo calculated its odds of a successful war against the United States would have looked different in February than it looked in November. Whether that difference would have been enough, whether 90 days of pause would have produced, in the end, a different outcome, I genuinely can't say. What I can say is that the modus vivendi existed. It was real, and its non-delivery was a human choice, made under pressure, with incomplete information, by people who believed they had no alternative. Kurusu stayed in Washington through December 7, 1941. He was at the Japanese embassy when the news of Pearl Harbor came through. His American wife was in their Washington apartment. He was arrested by American authorities shortly afterward and eventually repatriated in a prisoner exchange. He spent the war years largely in obscurity. In Japan, after the war, he was investigated for being insufficiently committed to the Japanese cause, too friendly with the Americans, too willing to make deals. In the United States, he was remembered, when he was remembered at all, as the envoy who had been conducting what many Americans came to regard as a deceptive negotiation, keeping Washington talking while the carrier force sailed. The evidence suggests his negotiations were genuine, even if his government's intentions were not. He died in 1954. His reputation in neither country was fully rehabilitated. The man who had flown the Clipper route across the Pacific to prevent a war had become instead a footnote to the war's beginning. There is a final, quiet detail in Kurusu's story that the major histories tend not to dwell on. His American wife, Alice, had been born in Indiana and had followed her husband across the world in his diplomatic postings. Their marriage, a Japanese diplomat and an American woman in 1941, in Washington, was itself a kind of counter-argument to the idea that war between the two countries was natural or inevitable. After the war, Alice and Saburo returned to Japan. She became Japanese in a way that many American wives of Japanese men were not, learning the language, integrating into the post-war Japanese society her husband had returned to. She outlived him. The marriage that had made Kurusu politically suspect in both countries, too American for Japan, too Japanese affiliated for America, lasted until his death. In our alternate history, where the war is postponed or redirected, Saburo Kurusu might have been remembered very differently, as the envoy who flew the Pacific, read the room correctly, and helped buy the time that changed everything. History is full of men whose timing was accurate and whose moment was wrong. Chapter 5. The Southern Road, Japan's Path Without Pearl Harbor. Somewhere in the Borneo jungle, roughly 55 kilometers inland from the east coast of the island, there are oil fields that in 1941 were producing more crude per day than most people in Tokyo had ever seen in one place. The Balikpapan complex, operated by the Royal Dutch Shell Company and its associated contractors, was one of the most productive petroleum facilities in Southeast Asia. The refinery there processed crude into fuel oil, aviation gasoline, and lubricants for a regional market that included, through 1940, the Japanese merchant fleet. It was a Dutch colonial asset, sitting on Indonesian soil, with a workforce of local Dayak laborers, Dutch engineers, and a small administrative garrison that had no meaningful military force behind it. Japan knew exactly what it was worth. The entire Southern strategy, the military logic driving Japan's push away from China and toward the resource-rich European colonial holdings of Southeast Asia, was, at bottom, a plan to put the Balikpapan refineries and facilities like them inside Japan's economic orbit. The Southern strategy was the one strategic objective on which the entire Japanese military establishment agreed. Army and Navy, General Staff, and combined fleet. They were unified on one point. Japan needed the resources of Southeast Asia, and it needed them before the oil reserve ran out. The disagreement was not about whether to go south. That was settled. The disagreement was about what to do with the United States while going south. Japan's military planners understood, with uncomfortable clarity, that taking Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines required seizing territory from British, Dutch, and American colonial holdings simultaneously. British Malaya supplied tin and rubber. The Dutch East Indies supplied oil. The Philippines, formerly still an American Commonwealth with a scheduled independence date of 1946, sat astride the supply lines that would need to be maintained between the captured southern territories and the Japanese home islands. The Philippines was both a military threat, in the form of General Douglas MacArthur's command with its B-17 bombers, capable of reaching Japanese shipping, and a political problem, because attacking it meant attacking American territory. In 1941, the Dutch East Indies was producing approximately 8 million tons of oil per year. Japan's minimum military and civilian requirement was estimated at roughly 5 million tons annually. The arithmetic looked like a solution. The politics were, as always, more complicated. The Dutch colonial government in Batavia had been running a negotiation with Japanese trade representatives since early 1941. Talk about expanded oil purchase agreements while doing everything possible to delay actual commitments. Their strategy was transparent and deliberate. They understood that selling oil to Japan would fuel the very military expansion that threatened their own colony's existence. The maximum concession they were prepared to make was publicly described as based on extraction capacity limits. Their private correspondence makes clear the extraction capacity was not, in fact, the limiting factor. They were stalling. They telegraphed their government in exile in London, asking for guidance on how long they could stall, and at what point continued delay became its own kind of provocation. The reply from London took 11 days to arrive. It said, in essence, keep stalling. What the Dutch negotiators didn't fully anticipate, and couldn't have, given the intelligence they had available, was the specific technical incompatibility between their oil and the IJN's machinery. I mentioned earlier the paraffin content problem in Tarakan crude, and its effect on destroyer boiler systems. The Balikpapan refinery compounded this in a different way. The facility was designed around Dutch Shell engineering standards, using Siemens industrial control systems and American-manufactured pump equipment. Japanese petroleum engineers, of whom there were very few with Dutch Shell standard qualifications, would have needed months of familiarization before operating the facility reliably, even under peaceful conditions. Japanese Army records indicate that by the time the actual landings at Balikpapan occurred in January of 1942, the assault troops had been specifically briefed on which valves not to destroy when clearing the facility, a tactical constraint that shaped the landing operation in ways that conventional amphibious assault doctrine didn't account for. The oil Japan needed was not just a number on a map. It was a physical system built by other people's engineers, and capturing it intact was a specialized problem that pure military force couldn't solve. The Philippines question is where every alternate timeline involving Japan's southern strategy ultimately collides with American military reality. MacArthur's command at Luzon in late 1941 included B-17 flying fortresses, long-range bombers theoretically capable of striking Japanese shipping in the Formosa Strait and the South China Sea. Japanese air commanders on Formosa viewed this as an unacceptable threat to the supply lines that would sustain any southward advance. Their operational plan required neutralizing the Philippine air bases before the southern advance could be considered secure. The result was a strategic logic trap. Japan could not safely execute the southern strategy while the Philippine air bases remained operational, but attacking those bases meant attacking American military installations, which meant a state of war with the United States, regardless of what happened or didn't happen at Pearl Harbor. Historian H.P. Wilmot argued in his 1982 study of Pacific strategy that Japan could theoretically have bypassed Luzon, relied on air power from Formosa to suppress MacArthur's bombers without landing on the island. Historian John Prados countered that Japanese logistical planners uniformly rejected the bypass option as unworkably risky, that the Luzon air bases were simply too dangerous to leave operational in the Japanese rear. The debate hasn't been conclusively resolved, but the weight of operational planning evidence is on Prados's side. The Philippines campaign, in some form, was almost certainly unavoidable, and the Philippines campaign meant a state of war with the United States. This is the structural problem that makes every optimistic version of the alternate history eventually come apart. Japan's southern strategy was not a strategy that could be executed without triggering American response. The only question was whether that response came in the form of a formal declaration of war following a surprise attack on Hawaii, or in the form of an escalating military confrontation triggered by combat in the Philippines and the South China Sea. The difference between those two scenarios is enormous in its implications for American public opinion, for the speed and nature of American mobilization, for the isolationist movement's political viability. A surprise attack on Pearl Harbor produced instant and total American fury. A slower escalation in the Philippines and the Pacific would have produced a more complicated, more contested path to the same destination. But the destination, American military involvement, was probably unavoidable given the geography and the strategy Japan had committed to. The Dutch acted on their own fears when the landings finally came. Dutch military engineers and colonial administrators had prepared demolition plans for the major oil facilities, and those plans were executed when the Japanese forces arrived. The Palembang refinery complex in Sumatra, which in actual history was seized in a combined air and seaborne assault in February of 1942, was substantially damaged in the Dutch scorched earth operation. Japanese engineers estimated that restoring the facility to full production would require approximately 14 months. The oil that Japan had gone to war to capture was a year away from being useful. In an alternate timeline where Japan acquires the Dutch East Indies through negotiation rather than conquest, where the deal is commercial rather than military, the sabotage teams never deploy. The refineries operate from day one. The oil flows. The 14-month delay disappears, and Japan's resource position, from early 1942 onward, is fundamentally better than it actually was. That's not a small difference. That's potentially the difference between a Japan that can sustain naval operations into 1943 with confidence, and a Japan that is already rationing aviation fuel by 1942. The Southern Road was always Japan's destination. The resource logic demanded it with the same implacability as the oil clock demanded action in 1941. What wasn't determined was the form that advance would take, the enemies it would create, and the industrial facilities it would capture intact or find already burning. The alternate history's most important variable isn't Pearl Harbor itself. It's whether Japan could have executed its southern ambitions in a way that kept the United States in a legal state of non-belligerence long enough for the strategic situation to change. The Philippines problem suggests probably not. The Dutch oil problem suggests that even a peaceful southern advance had its own technical complications that pure commercial negotiation couldn't resolve. And the oil clock, still running, still ticking at 2,900 barrels an hour in the Navy alone, demanded a pace of decision that the political and diplomatic process simply couldn't match. Chapter 6. The Sleeping Giant's Bedroom. America Without the Attack. The 30th of October, 1941, Madison Square Garden in New York City. 20,000 people inside, and by some accounts another 10,000 standing in the streets outside, listening through loudspeakers to a man they had come from across the Northeast to hear. Charles Lindbergh, the most famous aviator in the world and the most prominent public face of American isolationism, was speaking at an America First committee rally. The organization had, at its peak, more than 800,000 members, organized across 450 chapters nationwide. Its coalition was not what the retrospective caricature suggests, not simply fascist sympathizers or German agents, though there were some of those at its edges. It included Republican senators and progressive Democrats, farmers from the Midwest who had watched their sons come back broken from the First World War, industrialists who calculated that European war was bad for business, socialists who saw both sides of the European conflict as products of capitalist imperialism, and a very large number of ordinary American families who simply, stubbornly, did not want to bury another generation in foreign soil. The America First Committee was many things, some of them defensible and some of them not. It was not fringe. Lindbergh had arrived at his political position through a combination of genuine strategic analysis and personal experience that is difficult to evaluate fairly at this distance. He had toured the Luftwaffe's facilities in 1938 at Hermann Göring's invitation, and had come away convinced that German air power was so superior to what Britain and France could field that American intervention would be militarily futile, that the democracies would lose regardless of American support, and that intervention would only produce American casualties without changing the outcome. His assessment of German air strength turned out to be wrong in important ways, but it wasn't made up. He was an engineer who looked at aircraft specifications and production numbers and arrived at a conclusion. That the conclusion was wrong doesn't make the method dishonest. What did make Lindbergh's political position morally and factually indefensible was his September 11, 1941 speech in Des Moines, Iowa, in which he named the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration as the groups pushing America toward war. The Anti-Defamation League condemned the speech immediately. America First membership, which had been growing, began to drop. His usefulness as a coalition spokesman was severely damaged. The organization struggled to distance itself from the implications of what its most famous speaker had said. The irony is that the broader isolationist argument, that specific interest groups had a particular stake in American intervention, contained a structural truth even when it was expressed in morally unacceptable terms. Britain did want American intervention. The Roosevelt administration did believe that Nazi Germany represented a long-term threat to American security that had to be addressed. These were not secret agendas, they were publicly debated policy positions. What the isolationist movement was unable to process, what Lindbergh's diary entries from late 1941 suggest he privately understood, was that the Atlantic was already a war. American destroyers were already exchanging fire with German submarines. The USS Kearney was torpedoed on the 17th of October 1941. The USS Reuben James was sunk by a German submarine on the 31st of October, with the loss of 115 American sailors. Congress had not declared anything. Roosevelt had not asked it to. But the shooting was real, and the American dead were real, and the political framework of non-belligerence was becoming an increasingly strained fiction. The Gallup organization had been polling American opinion on the war question throughout 1941, and the numbers are worth sitting with because they define the political constraint within which Roosevelt was operating. A poll from November of 1941 found that 68% of Americans opposed sending the United States Army to fight in Europe. A separate poll from the same period found that 52% supported all aid short of war to Britain. These two numbers, taken together, describe a public that wanted Britain to survive, but didn't want to be the ones fighting for it. A public that was willing to be the arsenal of democracy as long as the dying was done by someone else. Without Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt faces these numbers indefinitely. The isolationist coalition may have been politically weakened by the Reuben James sinking and by Lindbergh's Des Moines speech, but it was not broken. It retained the capacity to block a formal war declaration in Congress. And Roosevelt, for all his political genius, had not found a way to bridge that gap without a direct attack on American territory. When I was reading through the material on the America First Committee's organizational structure, the way it used district-level voter data to identify and pressure wavering congressional representatives, the way it coordinated advertising buys and radio spot placements across regional media markets, I found myself thinking about how technically sophisticated this operation was for 1941. The organization had essentially invented political micro-targeting 60 years before the term existed. They understood that the vote to expand Lend-Lease, or the vote on a draft extension, or any other measure related to intervention, came down to specific swing votes in specific congressional districts, and they organized their lobbying pressure accordingly. They were fighting the policy rather than the politics, and they were doing it with remarkable operational precision. Their fundraising records show they had raised substantial sums for advertising and lobbying in the 12 months before Pearl Harbor. This was not a grassroots movement running on enthusiasm alone. It was a professionally organized political campaign. The point of all this is that without Pearl Harbor, isolationism doesn't simply dissolve, it adapts. The Atlantic incidents, the Kearney, the Reuben James, produce political pressure, but not political transformation. Roosevelt continues managing his two incompatible realities: the Atlantic quasi-war that he's fighting through executive action, and the domestic political constraint that prevents him from formalizing it. The November 1941 Lend-Lease appropriations are already drawing congressional fire. A serious isolationist campaign in early 1942, with America at peace in the Pacific and with the German offensive apparently stalled in Russia, could plausibly have reduced Lend-Lease deliveries to Britain and the Soviet Union. Not eliminated them. The program had too much institutional momentum, and Roosevelt too much executive authority for that, but reduced them. And reduction, in the arithmetic of the Battle of the Atlantic and the Eastern Front, had consequences that were not abstract. There is one biographical detail about the America First period that I want to leave with the listener, because I find it genuinely illuminating about contingency. Gerald Ford, who would eventually become the 38th President of the United States, was in 1941 a young Michigan lawyer and Navy veteran who supported the America First Committee and its positions. After Pearl Harbor, Ford later said, he realized that isolationism had been naive. Without Pearl Harbor, Ford's political identity never makes that pivot. The America First experience doesn't become something he has to explain away or grow beyond. It remains his position. How that affects a political career that eventually runs through Congress to the White House is impossible to calculate with precision. But it's a reminder that the domestic political consequences of Pearl Harbor's non-occurrence run deep into American life in ways that the strategic histories don't trace. Every person whose political convictions were reshaped by December 7, 1941, becomes, in the alternate timeline, a person whose convictions were never reshaped. The country that emerges from 1942 and 1943 without that collective shock is a different country in ways that go beyond any strategic variable. Lindbergh wrote his diary entry for December 6, 1941, the last entry he ever wrote as a private citizen at peace, in a reflective, almost resigned register. His mother had called him to ask if he thought they would be at war by Christmas. He wrote that he had told her he didn't know, and that the honest answer was that he thought they probably would be. The Atlantic was already a war. The writing was on the wall. Even the most committed isolationist in the country understood, privately, that the tide was running against him. What he couldn't have known, what no one could have known on December 6th, was that the decisive event wouldn't come from the Atlantic at all. It would come from the Pacific. It would come from a direction that almost no one had anticipated, in a form that left no ambiguity, no political space, no room for the careful distinctions between age short of war and war that the entire isolationist argument had been built upon. The next day, everything changed, but only because of what happened the next day. And that's the point of this entire story. Chapter 7. The Wehrmacht at the gates of Moscow. The 5th of December, 1941. 2 days before Pearl Harbor. Not in the Pacific, in Russia. The temperature on the approaches to Moscow had fallen to roughly minus 28 degrees Celsius in some sectors of the front. Figures recorded by Soviet meteorological stations and later confirmed in German Army Group Center's operational logs. The Wehrmacht's advance had stalled not because any Soviet commander had issued a brilliant order, but because the machines simply stopped working. Trucks wouldn't start. Recoil mechanisms on field guns froze in the fired position. The lubricating oil in tank transmissions had congealed into something closer to axle grease than fluid. The soldiers tasked with restarting these vehicles were wearing standard Wehrmacht-issue leather marching boots, designed for the Western European campaign of 1940, boots that were adequate for the mud of Belgium and the cobblestones of France, and catastrophically inadequate for a Russian December. In November alone, Army Group Center had suffered roughly 46,000 casualties, and the Germans were losing more men to frostbite than to direct combat. The army that had driven 900 kilometers in 4 months had run out of road, run out of winter clothing, and run out of the margin that summer momentum had provided. Into that paralysis, on the morning of the 5th of December, came the Soviet counteroffensive. It launched along the Kalinin front north of Moscow, and spread southward along the line over the following 2 days, precisely as the German Army Group Center's temperature records were showing their lowest readings of the season. The formations attacking were not the exhausted Soviet rifle units that Army Group Center had been grinding through since June. These soldiers wore white cotton smocks over heavy wadded cotton jackets, with hoods that covered the face in the wind. Their footwear was Valenki, traditional Russian felt boots constructed from compressed sheep's wool, introduced formally into Red Army issue in August of 1941. The Valenki kept toes and heels functional at temperatures where the German leather boot was, quite literally, a medical liability. Their T-34 tanks rode on wide, flat tracks that distributed weight across the snow's surface and allowed them to maintain mobility where German armor was bogged down or immobilized. These were the Siberian divisions, formations drawn from the Soviet Far Eastern Military District, transferred west in October and November, and available for the counteroffensive because someone in Moscow had received a message in mid-September that the Kwantung Army would not be attacking from Manchuria. That someone was Joseph Stalin. The message came from a man named Richard Sorge, codename Ramsey, a German journalist working in Tokyo, who was, in reality, a Soviet military intelligence officer who had spent 8 years building sources inside the German embassy in Tokyo and the fringes of Japanese military and government circles. Sorge's intelligence product on Japan's intentions toward the Soviet Union was the most strategically consequential intelligence work of the entire war. In mid-September of 1941, he transmitted to Moscow a clear assessment. Japan would not attack the Soviet Union in the near future. The Kwantung Army, Japan's Manchurian force of approximately 700,000 men, would remain defensive, and the strategic pressure on the Soviet Far East was not going to materialize before spring at the earliest. The assessment was graded high reliability by GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and corroborated by other sources. On the 18th of October, 1941, Sorge was arrested in Tokyo by the Kempeitai, Japanese counterintelligence. His message was already in Moscow. It was already changing the war. The transfer of Siberian divisions westward had begun in mid-October, running on the Trans-Siberian Railway in a logistical operation of considerable complexity. The specific numbers are debated in the historical literature, but the commonly cited figure involves somewhere in the range of 18 rifle divisions, plus substantial supporting arms, including approximately 1,700 tanks and over 1,500 aircraft, moved from the Far East to the Western Front between October and December of 1941. These weren't reserve formations filled with half-trained conscripts. They were frontline units, fully equipped, winter-capable, and commanded by officers who had not spent 4 months in the grinding defensive nightmare of Barbarossa. The Soviet counteroffensive of December 1941 was won by these men, in their felt boots and white smocks, riding T-34s with wide tracks across a landscape that had turned hostile to everything German. When the counterattack eventually pushed Army Group Center back by distances of up to 200 kilometers in some sectors, the Siberian formations were the cutting edge of every advance. Here is where the alternate history enters its most vertiginous territory, because the thread connecting Pearl Harbor to Moscow's survival runs through a German journalist in a Japanese prison cell. The logic is direct but fragile. Remove Pearl Harbor, and Japan's strategic intentions toward the Soviet Union remain more ambiguous for longer. Sorge is still arrested on the 18th of October. His fate is unchanged. His mid-September message has still been transmitted. But in the weeks after his arrest, with Pearl Harbor not having happened, the U.S.-Japan diplomatic situation remains unresolved. The Kwantung Army is still sitting in Manchuria, 700,000 men, watching the Soviet Far East. Stalin receives Sorge's assessment, but cannot verify it with the same confidence he had in the actual timeline, because the definitive act that resolved Japan's strategic orientation, the attack on Pearl Harbor, which committed Japan irrevocably to a Pacific War, and away from any northern advance, hasn't happened yet. Does Stalin still transfer the full complement of 18 divisions to Moscow? Historian David Glantz has argued he would, because Army Group Center's threat to Moscow was so immediate and so existential that rational military calculation demanded the transfer, regardless of Eastern uncertainty. Max Hastings, writing in Inferno in 2011, was more cautious, suggesting Stalin's confidence about Japan was genuine and influential. I find I cannot resolve this disagreement with certainty. What I can say is that the margin by which the Moscow counteroffensive succeeded was not large, and that a partial transfer, 10 divisions rather than 18, produces a meaningfully different battle. The T-34's performance in the December counteroffensive is worth examining technically, because it illustrates a manufacturing philosophy gap that had nothing to do with diplomatic cables and everything to do with national assumptions about where wars would be fought. Soviet tank designers, working in the late 1930s under a program that prioritized the likely terrain of Eastern Europe and Western Russia, had incorporated a wide-track design that distributed the vehicle's 32-ton weight across roughly 600 millimeters of track surface, significantly wider than contemporary German tank designs. On packed snow and ice, this difference translated into mobility. German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, with narrower tracks, lost traction and became effectively immobile at the snow depths common around Moscow in December of 1941. Soviet T-34s used their tracks to pack down snow ahead of infantry advances. German armor simply stopped. This wasn't intelligence failure or strategic miscalculation. It was a design choice made years earlier that reflected each army's assumptions about the operational environment. The Wehrmacht had prepared for Western Europe. It got Russia. When I was working through the operational records of the December counteroffensive, I found myself particularly struck by a detail in German Army Group Center's Quartermaster War Diary from the first week of December. Not the casualty figures or the equipment losses, but the notation about lubricating oil. The standard Wehrmacht motor lubricant had a viscosity specification designed for temperatures down to roughly -15 degrees Celsius. At -28, it thickened to a consistency that made engine starting essentially impossible without preheating equipment that most formations didn't have. The Soviets had anticipated this and issued vehicles with an Arctic-grade lubricant that remained functional at -40. This was not an accident of supply or a last-minute improvisation. It was a deliberate procurement decision made years before the war by someone in the Red Army's technical branch, who understood that Soviet vehicles might need to start in Siberian winters. That person's anonymous foresight contributed more to the Moscow counteroffensive than any single tactical decision made in December of 1941. Sorge was hanged by the Japanese government on the 7th of November, 1944, 3 years after his arrest. He was executed after a lengthy legal process that included several years of imprisonment, during which Soviet intelligence apparently declined to negotiate his release. His last documented words, according to the account preserved in post-war Japanese court records, were, "The Red Army." He was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously by Nikita Khrushchev in 1965, more than 20 years after his execution. Stalin's silence about Sorge's contribution had a specific institutional logic. Acknowledging that Sorge's Tokyo intelligence had been decisive at Moscow would mean acknowledging that Sorge had also warned Stalin about Operation Barbarossa in advance, a warning Stalin had dismissed as British disinformation. The man whose last intelligence message may have saved Moscow had issued an earlier warning that Stalin had ignored. Acknowledging one meant admitting the other. So Stalin acknowledged neither. Sergei died in a Japanese prison without his own country admitting what he had done, because the admission was too politically costly for a leader who had survived by rewriting inconvenient histories. In the alternate timeline where Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, Sergei's October message still reaches Moscow. The intelligence is still there. Stalin still knows, to some degree, that Japan is not planning an immediate northern attack. What changes is the confidence level, because the definitive act that proved Japanese orientation in the actual timeline, the Pacific War's declaration, hasn't happened. I keep returning to the specific phrase in Sergei's September transmission. Japan would not attack in the near future. Not never. Not definitively. In the near future. How near? In the actual timeline, near future extended to the end of the war. In the alternate timeline, with Japan not yet committed to a Pacific War, near future is a more elastic phrase. A Stalin who is somewhat less certain about the Kwantung Army is a Stalin who might hedge, keep 8 of the 18 Siberian divisions in the Far East as insurance. 8 divisions retained in Manchuria is 10 divisions reaching Moscow. 10 divisions instead of 18 produce a counteroffensive that pushes Army Group Center back, probably, but with less momentum. A German defensive position closer to Moscow in the spring of 1942. A different Eastern Front in 1942. A different war. The Eastern Front is where the 20th century was decided. Not in the Channel, not in the desert, not in the Pacific. Roughly 80% of all German military casualties in the Second World War occurred on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union mobilized an estimated 34 million military personnel and suffered somewhere between 8 and 11 million military dead. Germany deployed approximately 17 million on the Eastern Front over the war's duration and suffered approximately 4 million dead there. These numbers dwarf everything that happened in North Africa, Italy, or Normandy. The entire Western Allied effort, from the North African landings to the Rhine crossing, involved at most a few million combat soldiers at any given moment. The Eastern Front involved tens of millions, simultaneously, for 47 consecutive months. Understanding this is understanding why the Moscow counteroffensive matters so much in the alternate timeline. It isn't a battle that determined whether or not Germany might win. By December of 1941, Germany had probably already forfeited its best chance of winning. What the Moscow counteroffensive determined was the shape of everything that followed. How long the war would last, how much ground Germany would hold, how far the Red Army would eventually advance when the tide finally, permanently turned. All of that depends, in the alternate history, on a Soviet spy's September message, a transfer of divisions by rail, and whether Pearl Harbor happened to make the message's implications certain. Chapter 8. The Pacific Fleet rots at anchor. The 28th of November, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. The aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, hull designation CV-6, a Yorktown-class fleet carrier displacing approximately 19,800 tons at standard load, measuring 809 feet from stem to stern, put to sea at 0800 hours on a routine ferry mission. She was carrying a Marine fighter squadron, 12 Grumman F-4F Wildcats of VM F-211, bound for Wake Island, roughly 2,100 kilometers southwest of Hawaii. The Enterprise was not at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December. She was returning from Wake Island, steaming east when the attack hit. In actual history, this is presented as a fortunate escape. The carrier was at sea, the carrier survived, the carrier went on to fight. But peel back the narrative of fortunate escape and look instead at the ship herself, the fleet she belonged to, and the doctrine that governed both, and you find something more complicated. A navy that was physically capable, but intellectually unprepared for the war it was about to fight, operating under a strategic framework that the coming disaster would shatter and rebuild, in a form that no peacetime institution would willingly have produced. The U.S. Pacific Fleet's tactical doctrine in the autumn of 1941 assigned the aircraft carrier to a supporting role. This is the detail that most popular histories of the Pacific War quietly set aside, because it sits uncomfortably with the retrospective image of carrier aviation as the obvious future of naval warfare. But in late 1941, the Standard Fleet Exercise Doctrine placed carrier air groups in an anti-aircraft and reconnaissance role. Their job was to clear enemy aircraft from the sky above the battle line and report on enemy dispositions, not to conduct independent offensive strikes against enemy surface formations. The battleship remained the primary offensive instrument. The Pacific War Plan, War Plan Orange, which had been updated into the Rainbow series by 1941, envisioned the Pacific Fleet's battleships advancing westward toward the Philippines and Japan's mandated island chain, with carriers and cruisers providing the screen. This wasn't institutional blindness. It was doctrine built on the available evidence from the last major naval war, from Jutland in 1916, and from 2 decades of interwar tactical development. Several forward-thinking officers were arguing for carrier primacy by 1941. The Naval War College had been discussing the concept seriously since the late 1930s. But arguing in peacetime and getting institutional change in peacetime are different things. The 8 battleships moored at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, represent, in aggregate, one of the most expensive expressions of pre-war strategic thinking in American military history. The USS Arizona was commissioned in 1916. Her main battery of 12 14-inch guns, arranged in 4 triple turrets, had a maximum range of roughly 36 kilometers at full elevation, adequate for the Jutland-era battle line, entirely irrelevant to a Pacific war fought primarily by aircraft launched from moving ships. Her maximum sustained speed was approximately 21 knots, adequate for the battle line scenario of the 1920s fleet problem exercises, insufficient for the screening and maneuver requirements of carrier-centered operations. Her annual maintenance cost, including periodic dry dock periods at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, was several $1 million of a Pacific Fleet budget that was simultaneously trying to build modern carriers, train naval aviators, and expand the destroyer force. In our alternate timeline, the Arizona is operational through 1942. She is undamaged. She is also, in every tactical scenario that the Pacific War would actually produce, a very expensive museum piece. The Two-Ocean Navy Act of 1940 had authorized an extraordinary expansion of American naval power, including 7 new fleet carriers of the Essex class. The first of these, USS Essex herself, was commissioned in December of 1942 in actual history, accelerated by the wartime urgency that Pearl Harbor had produced. The Essex class represented a genuine leap, displacing approximately 27,000 tons at standard load, capable of carrying over 90 aircraft, with a maximum speed of 33 knots and a flight deck length of 872 feet. In the alternate timeline, without Pearl Harbor's galvanizing emergency, Essex-class commissioning dates slip. Shipyard priority, congressional appropriations, workforce allocation. All of these move at peacetime pace, without a declared war, to create urgency. The first Essex-class carrier in the alternate timeline might commission in the spring or summer of 1943, rather than December of 1942. 6 months doesn't sound dramatic. In a Pacific War that might start in mid-1942, 6 months of delayed carrier availability is the difference between fighting with a handful of pre-war fleet carriers against Japan's undamaged 6-carrier Kido Butai, or fighting with the first Essex-class ships already in the line. Japan's carrier force in the alternate timeline needs to be considered with the same precision. The 6 fleet carriers of Kido Butai, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu, the Shokaku, and the Zuikaku, were, pilot for pilot and aircrew for aircrew, the most experienced carrier aviation force in the world in December of 1941. Japan had been conducting carrier aviation operations in combat conditions in China since 1937. The senior aviators of Kido Butai had between 3 and 5 years of operational flying experience in combat conditions before a single American carrier pilot had fired a shot in anger. This experience base wasn't just about hours in the logbook. It was about the specific cognitive hardware that combat builds. The ability to execute a 60-degree dive-bombing run against a moving target while absorbing anti-aircraft fire, maintain formation discipline at 250 knots, and find a carrier deck on the return leg with 20 minutes of fuel remaining. These skills deteriorate without constant exercise and atrophy completely when the men who possess them are killed. In the actual Pacific War, the attrition of Coral Sea, Midway, and the Guadalcanal campaign bled this human capital to irreplaceability within 18 months. In the alternate timeline, through mid-1942, all of it is intact. the fuel tank farm's survival in the actual Pearl Harbor attack deserves more attention than it usually receives, because it illuminates something important about the limits of even a successful surprise attack. The farm held approximately 4.5 million gallons of oil at the time of the December 7th strike, enough to sustain Pacific Fleet operations for a substantial period. Admiral Husband Kimmel, commanding officer at Pearl Harbor, stated afterwards that losing those reserves would have forced the Pacific Fleet to operate from the U.S. West Coast, potentially delaying American offensive operations by a year. Nagumo chose not to launch a third strike. His reasoning was a combination of legitimate caution, concern about American aircraft that might have escaped the first two waves, concern about his own aircraft losses on a third strike, and the general principle of preserving his force, and the institutional conservatism that Yamamoto had spent months fighting to overcome. The fuel farm's survival is a reminder that even the actual attack was incomplete. In our alternate timeline, there is no attack at all, and the fuel farm sits full and irrelevant under the Hawaiian sun. The Pacific Fleet's logistical infrastructure is entirely intact for whatever war eventually begins. I want to dwell for a moment on what the alternate Pacific Fleet looks like from the inside, from the perspective of the officers and enlisted men serving in it through the winter of 1941 and into 1942. Without a declared war, without the shock of Sunday morning, the fleet continues its peacetime-style operational cycle. Ships go to sea for exercises. Ships come back for maintenance. The Enterprise's boiler overhaul, flagged in the watch officer's deck log as needed before the next extended deployment, gets scheduled, gets done, takes 6 weeks. The ship is unavailable for those 6 weeks. The battleships rotate through the Navy Yard on their standard maintenance schedules. Crews take liberty in Honolulu. Officers attend doctrine conferences and write memos arguing about carrier employment. The war is coming. Everyone can feel it in the quality of the diplomatic cables, and the tightening of the schedules, and the way the intelligence summaries are getting more specific about Japanese movements in Southeast Asia. But it hasn't arrived yet. And a Navy that hasn't been attacked is a Navy that hasn't been given permission to stop arguing and start fighting. The Zero's performance specifications are essential to understanding the alternate timeline's opening naval air engagements. The Mitsubishi A6M0, specifically the Model 21, the carrier variant operating from Kido Butai in late 1941, had a maximum speed of roughly 332 miles per hour at altitude, a climb rate of approximately 3,000 feet per minute, and a combat range of nearly 1,800 miles. More tactically relevant was its turn radius at medium altitude, which was substantially tighter than any American carrier fighter available in late 1941. Against the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, maximum speed approximately 318 miles per hour, climb rate roughly 2,000 feet per minute, considerably heavier and less agile than the Zero. The Zero's advantages in a turning engagement were real and documented. The Thatch Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch in the spring of 1941, was specifically designed to compensate for the Wildcat's inability to outturn the Zero. Two fighters flying in mutual support, weaving toward each other to give each a deflection shot at any Zero following the other. The tactic was based on intelligence about the Zero's performance, and it worked. It was first employed effectively at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. In the alternate timeline, without Midway's specific crucible, the tactical refinement of anti-Zero doctrine accumulates more slowly. American carrier pilots are fighting an opponent they understand less well in the war's opening engagements. The doctrinal revolution that Pearl Harbor forced on the U.S. Navy is the most uncomfortable variable in this chapter, because it requires acknowledging something that no responsible historian should leave unstated. The loss of 2,403 American lives on December 7th produced, among its many consequences, a faster and more complete transformation of the Navy's carrier doctrine than any peacetime argument could have generated. This doesn't make Pearl Harbor good. It makes it costly in one way, while providing an advantage in another. And the two things cannot be separated into a simple moral accounting. The officers who survived December 7th and went on to design the carrier task force doctrine that dominated the later Pacific War had the specific experience of watching a battleship-centered fleet destroyed in a single morning. That experience was purchased at a price that no one should pretend was acceptable. But it was the price that changed the institution. Without it, the the institution changes more slowly, by argument rather than by catastrophe, by doctrine papers and fleet exercise critiques, and the gradual accumulation of evidence from a war that develops in a different shape. The Navy that eventually fights in the alternate Pacific is not necessarily worse. It is differently educated, and the difference in its education costs something, somewhere, at some point in the engagement, where the lesson it didn't learn in December of '41 would have made the difference. The Enterprise came back from Wake Island to find Pearl Harbor burning. She logged the site in the deck log with the characteristic understatement of naval official records, a notation about smoke visible from roughly 25 miles, followed by the change in operational orders that war requires. In our alternate timeline, she came back to find Pearl Harbor quiet. The deck log notation for that week would have read, "Boiler overhaul commenced, 7 December, 1941. Pearl Harbor Navy Yard. The boilers get fixed, the maintenance cycle continues, the war approaches, and the Navy prepares, carefully and slowly, for a conflict whose shape it hasn't yet been forced to understand." Chapter 9. The Pacific Empire and its Paper Vision. October of 1941, Tokyo. The Cabinet Information Bureau, Japan's government propaganda and public information agency, established in 1940 to consolidate control of wartime messaging, was printing a pamphlet. It was 12 pages, illustrated with maps showing Japan at the center of an interconnected Asian economic network, trade routes radiating outward like spokes, raw materials flowing inward from the periphery toward the Japanese home islands. The pamphlet was titled, in translation, "The Construction of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere," and it described a future Asia of mutual benefit and shared development, free from Western colonial exploitation, guided by Japanese leadership toward a cooperative modern future. It was, as government publications go, reasonably well produced. The maps were clear, the argument structured, the language of liberation and solidarity deployed with professional confidence. A copy of this pamphlet ended up in American intelligence hands at some point during the war. It is preserved in an archival collection, and someone, an analyst, apparently, has written 2 words in pencil in the margin beside the passage about mutual benefit. The words are, "says who." They are not dated. They don't need to be. The co-prosperity sphere was Japan's answer to the question every empire eventually has to answer. What do you tell the people you're administering? The honest answer, "We are here for the resources, your labor, and your compliance," is not an answer that sustains administrative efficiency for long. Japan had an alternative answer, developed over the preceding decade, and refined as the Southern advance became more clearly a military rather than a commercial project. We are liberating Asia from Western colonialism, building a family of Asian nations under Japanese guidance toward shared prosperity and mutual defense. The ideology had genuine intellectual content in some of its academic formulations. The critique of Western imperialism in Asia was not without substance, and some of the early co-prosperity theorists were sincere in their Pan-Asian vision. What the ideology became in practice, in the occupied territories of China and Korea, and eventually Southeast Asia, was a rationalization for extraction. The price controls Japan imposed on agricultural products in occupied China consistently favored Japanese buyers. The currency arrangements created inflationary conditions that made real capital accumulation by local populations structurally impossible. The labor mobilization programs in Korea and Manchuria drafted workers into Japanese industrial projects under conditions that bore more resemblance to conscription than employment. The China War was the weight that sat on top of every calculation Japan made in 1941, and it's the structural context for everything the co-prosperity sphere was trying to justify. By the autumn of 1941, Japan had been fighting in China for 4 years, following the Marco Polo Bridge incident of July 1937. The campaign had consumed Japanese military dead, estimated at approximately 185,000 by 1941. Japanese Finance Ministry estimates, compiled for the Cabinet Planning Board, put the daily cost of the China campaign at roughly 5 million yen per day by 1940, a figure growing as garrisoning costs expanded faster than any foreseeable resolution of the conflict. The Chinese nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek had retreated to the interior city of Chongqing and continued to resist from there, supplied partly through the Burma Road and increasingly through American Lend-Lease. Chinese Communist forces under Mao Zedong controlled the rural north and northwest through a guerrilla structure that conventional Japanese military force could suppress locally but could never eradicate. Japan controlled the major cities, the coastal provinces, and the principal railway lines. It didn't control the countryside. In a country of approximately 450 million people, that was the whole problem. The co-prosperity sphere's relationship to the China War was as a justificatory framework, not a solution. Pan-Asian liberation rhetoric couldn't explain why Japan was still fighting in a country it had been trying to pacify for 4 years. What it could do was provide a narrative template that made the southern expansion, the seizure of Southeast Asia's resources, look like something other than naked conquest. The southern territories were going to join a community of Asian nations, freely chosen, mutually beneficial. The pamphlets said so. The reality of Japanese administration in every territory it occupied said otherwise. By 1943, in actual history, the yen block currency system had produced inflation in the Philippines that was running in the hundreds of % range. Military scrip printed by Japanese occupation authorities and redeemed at exchange rates determined by Tokyo had essentially destroyed the purchasing power of ordinary commerce for Filipino civilians. The agricultural requisition system in occupied China, which extracted rice, cotton, and other staples from Chinese farmers at controlled prices well below market rates, was generating food shortages in areas that had been agricultural exporters before the occupation. These weren't the outcomes of malice alone. They were the structural outcomes of an economic system designed to transfer value from the periphery to the center. In our alternate timeline, where Japan goes south without formally going to war with the United States, the co-prosperity sphere encounters a different kind of problem: legitimacy without the unifying clarity of war. In actual history, the formal state of war with the Western powers allowed the Japanese government to mobilize national resources at emergency pace and to suppress domestic dissent under wartime regulations. It also provided the co-prosperity sphere's ideology with an enemy, the Anglo-American colonial system, against which the Pan-Asian alternative could be defined. Without the Pacific War's formal declaration, Japan is occupying Southeast Asian territories in a legal and political gray zone. The British are still at war with Germany, but not necessarily with Japan. The Dutch colonial government in Batavia is formally neutral or under duress. The United States is applying economic pressure through the asset freeze, but hasn't declared war. The Philippines Commonwealth government is watching. In this ambiguous environment, the co-prosperity sphere's liberation narrative loses its contrast. There's no clear Western enemy from which Asia is being liberated. There's just Japan, taking territory and calling it cooperation. The Philippine question is the clearest illustration of the co-prosperity sphere's fundamental political contradiction. In actual history, Japan invaded the Philippines by force, following a brutal military campaign, installed a nominally independent government under José Laurel, and found that a significant armed resistance arose within months and never fully subsided. The Hukbalahap, the People's Anti-Japanese Army, drawn from the peasant communist movement in central Luzon, had perhaps 30,000 active fighters by 1943. The resistance was not primarily nationalist in the conventional sense. It drew on specific class grievances and local political traditions that predated the Japanese occupation. In the alternate timeline, where Japan has not attacked Pearl Harbor and is attempting to negotiate rather than conquer, the Philippines' political situation is more complicated. The Philippine Commonwealth under Manuel Quezon had been promised independence by the United States in 1946. Some Filipino political figures, including Quezon himself at various points, had expressed interest in early independence that Japan might facilitate. Others understood what Japanese administration looked like from its record in Korea and China. The population was divided, not uniformly hostile, but not uniformly receptive either. The co-prosperity sphere's promise of liberation arrived in the Philippines already accompanied by the reputation of the China campaign. The Indian Ocean is the strategic opportunity that the alternate timeline opens most clearly, and it's the one that most histories of the no Pearl Harbor scenario under-examine. Japan's six-carrier Kido Butai, free from commitment to a Pearl Harbor strike and its Pacific War consequences, is available for sustained operations westward. In April of 1942, in actual history, a Japanese carrier force conducted an Indian Ocean raid that sank the British carrier HMS Hermes, the heavy cruisers HMS Dorsetshire and HMS Cornwall, and caused serious damage to British naval facilities at Colombo and Trincomalee in Ceylon. This operation, commanded in the actual war by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, was strategically curtailed by the need to return to the Pacific for operations against Port Moresby and Midway. In the alternate timeline, without those Pacific commitments, the Indian Ocean raid doesn't end in April. It continues. A sustained Japanese naval presence in the Indian Ocean threatens the Murmansk convoy's southern alternative routing, threatens British supply lines to the 8th Army in North Africa via Suez, and threatens India itself, which in 1942 was already in political crisis over the Congress Party's Quit India movement. A Japan that can project carrier power into the Indian Ocean indefinitely is a Japan that can, potentially, cut Britain's empire in half at the waterline. The yen block's currency mechanics deserve a specific paragraph, because they are the mechanism through which the co-prosperity sphere's extraction operates, and most discussions of Japanese war economics pass over them too quickly. The system worked as follows. Japan established military administration currency authorities in each occupied territory, which printed local scrip denominated in the local currency. The scrip was legally equivalent to Bank of Japan notes, but was not backed by gold or convertible into Japanese yen at a fixed rate that favored the holder. When Japan needed goods or services from an occupied territory, it paid in scrip. When occupied territory residents needed to import goods from Japan or transact with Japanese-controlled businesses, they paid in scrip. The exchange rate between scrip and real yen was set by Japanese administrative authorities and typically moved to Japan's advantage over time. The result was a one-way valve. Value flowed into Japan and scrip flowed out. Inflation in the occupied territories was not a policy failure. It was a policy success from the perspective of an extractive system trying to minimize the real cost of imperial administration. Understanding this mechanism changes how you evaluate the co-prosperity sphere's longevity. Even in an alternate timeline where Japan maintains the sphere for a decade without major external disruption, the economic contradictions built into the currency system would have generated political resistance that military force alone could not permanently suppress. The co-prosperity sphere, in the end, was a vision with a gap at its center, where the economic logic lived. Every empire has a brochure. The Spanish Empire had a religious mission. The British had the civilizing standard. France had its mission civilisatrice. Japan had Pan-Asian liberation and the doctrine of co-prosperity. What all of these had in common was a narrative designed to make the people doing the extracting feel justified, and the people being extracted from feel grateful. None of them worked indefinitely, because the gap between the brochure and the reality was always visible to the people living in the reality, even when it wasn't visible to the people printing the brochures. In the alternate timeline, Japan's co-prosperity sphere faces this gap earlier and more clearly than in the actual war, because the unifying external threat of Anglo-American War, which in the actual Pacific War gave the sphere's ideology its contrast, never fully materializes. Japan is left administering a continental empire in a world where the Western powers it was supposed to be opposing have not been fully defeated, are not fully at war, and have not been fully discredited. The penciled "says who" in the margin of the October 41 pamphlet captures something the pamphlet's authors couldn't quite see, that the question of who decides the terms of co-prosperity is precisely the question that an empire built on force cannot answer honestly. Chapter 10. The Notebook in the Drawer. A small standard-issue field notebook, the kind the Imperial Japanese Army distributed to all enlisted personnel. Gray cardboard cover, 30-lined pages, the Army's chrysanthemum crest printed on the inside cover. This one was carried by a private first class in the 16th Division from the Osaka and Kyoto recruiting region, a man named Hara, for 4 years of the China campaign beginning in 1939. His family published it in a limited edition of 300 copies in Osaka in 1968. It received a single academic review in a Japanese historical journal and was never reprinted or translated. I have been reading it in the original, working through a translation with help from a colleague, for several months now. The handwriting changes over the 4 years of entries. In the early pages it is neat, careful, the hand of a young man who takes his record-keeping seriously. In the pages from late 1941 and into 1942, the characters are still legible but compressed. Shorter entries, shorter sentences, as if he had decided that less needed to be said, or that less could be borne to write. The notebook doesn't explain the change, it just records it, the way a barometer records pressure without explaining the weather. Hara's division, the 16th, was a formation with a name that appears in several places in the China campaign records, deployed to the Yangtze River Valley region, and involved in the garrisoning and pacification operations that constituted the daily reality of occupation warfare. The campaign's official records describe his period of service in the language of military operations: areas secured, positions held, patrols conducted. Hara's notebook describes the same period in different language. He writes about distances, the march from one position to the next, measured in hours and in the condition of the road. He writes about food, not complaints about quality, but careful notations about quantity, about the days when the supply wagons came and the days when they didn't. He writes about the men in his section by nickname, not name, which was a small protection against the notebook being read by the wrong people. He writes, in the entry I keep returning to from October of 1941, "We burned the village this morning. I did not watch. I told Corporal Matsuda I had a stomach complaint. He knew I was lying. I will not write what happened." The period after "happened" is placed with more force than the periods elsewhere on the page, as if the pen stopped and the hand pressing it continued for a moment. He moves, in the next entry, to a note about the temperature. He never returns to that village. The Imperial Japanese Army's supply doctrine in China operated on a principle that the administrative records describe with bureaucratic neutrality, and that Hara's notebook illuminates from the inside. The formal logistics chain was designed to provide approximately 60% of minimum daily caloric requirements per soldier in the field. The remaining 40% was designated as local procurement, which was the Army's official term for taking food from civilian populations in the occupied territories. This wasn't a breakdown of supply, it was the intended system. The Army's China Expeditionary Force operational manuals included formal procedures for local procurement, collection schedules, responsible officers, documentation requirements. What the manuals didn't include was any mechanism for distinguishing between taking food from a population that had enough and taking it from a population that didn't. That determination was left to the officer on the ground, in a formation that had been operating in the same region for 2 or 3 years, and that had conducted local procurement in the same villages multiple times. By 1941, in the areas where Hara's division operated, the overlap between what was available to procure and what the civilian population needed to survive had been compressed by years of repeated extraction to something uncomfortably close to the same number. Each soldier in the 16th Division carried a standard load of 120 rounds of rifle ammunition in a combat configuration, 80 rounds in the basic pouch and 40 in the reserve pouch, for a total weight of approximately 2.5 kilograms in ammunition alone. The standard weapon was the Type 38 Arisaka rifle, a bolt-action design first introduced in 1905 and still the IJA's standard infantry weapon in 1941, 36 years after its introduction. The weapon was reliable and accurate, well suited to the kind of infantry operations the China campaign required. It was also an indicator of how the IJA had been structured, optimized for conventional infantry operations against an enemy without significant mechanized or armored force, with ammunition discipline as the primary tactical constraint. The China War's guerrilla dimension had not fundamentally changed this doctrine. The IJA was still thinking in terms of conventional operations, in which ammunition management and fire discipline were the primary tactical variables, in a campaign that had become, by 1941, as much an administrative problem as a military one. In the alternate timeline, the world where Pearl Harbor doesn't happen, Hara is still in China in December of 1941. He is still there in December of 1942. The China War doesn't end because the Pacific War was declared elsewhere. In the alternate world, the Pacific War either hasn't started yet or has started differently, and the China campaign simply continues without any of the larger strategic narrative that the Pacific War gave it in actual history. This is the aspect of the alternate timeline that the strategic histories can't fully capture. They can model carrier force ratios and oil production curves and congressional appropriation schedules. They can't model what it means to be Hara, to be in a war that has no visible end and no coherent explanation, writing entries that get shorter every month, in a notebook with a chrysanthemum crest on the inside cover, in a village in central China in the winter of 1942, with the temperature dropping and the supply wagons 2 days late. The psychological records from the China Expeditionary Army tell their own story. Military psychiatry in the Imperial Japanese Army was a marginal discipline. The institutional culture was deeply hostile to any acknowledgement of psychological incapacity as legitimate, and soldiers who reported psychological symptoms faced a social and institutional stigma that made formal reporting rare. Despite this, the China Expeditionary Army's medical records include a consistent thread of entries about what the records call neurasthenia, a diagnostic category that served as a clinical umbrella for what later medicine would call combat stress disorder, depression, and chronic adjustment disorders. The rates among soldiers with 3 or more years of continuous China service were, by the medical record's own accounting, notably higher than among recently arrived formations. Hara had been in China for 2 years by December of 1941. He would be there for at least 2 more. The notebook doesn't use medical language. It uses compression, the reduction of the recorded world to smaller and smaller elements, as if the act of recording was becoming more costly with each entry. The China War's cost in Japanese lives is a number that sits uncomfortably at the edge of most histories of the Pacific War, because the Pacific War's dramatic arc, Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, the island-hopping campaign, Hiroshima, has a narrative shape that the China campaign resists. The China campaign doesn't have a Midway. It has Nanjing, which is not a battle, but an atrocity. And it has the endless, undramatic garrisoning and patrol operations that Hara's notebook records. And it has a casualty count that climbed past 100,000 Japanese military dead before Pearl Harbor even happened, and continued climbing for 4 more years. In the alternate timeline, without the Pacific War's expansion to give the China campaign new strategic meaning, the Japanese government faces a progressively more difficult internal argument about what the China campaign is for. The co-prosperity sphere's rhetoric can cover the southern advance because the South is new and the resources are visible. It cannot easily cover a 4th or 5th year in China, where the resources are already exhausted and the resistance is still there. I want to be direct about what this chapter is arguing through Hara's notebook, because it's easy to get lost in the abstraction. The China War was not an abstraction to the people in it. It was specific days and specific places, with specific temperatures and specific shortages, and specific things that could be written about, and specific things that couldn't. Hara's October notebook entry, "I did not watch," describes a moment of moral refusal that the war's structure made ultimately meaningless. He didn't watch, but the village burned anyway, and he was in the unit that burned it, and he carried his Arisaka the next morning, and his 120 rounds, and his 40% deficit caloric situation, just as he had the morning before. The alternate timeline doesn't change this specific entry. The village still burns in October of 1941, regardless of what happens at Pearl Harbor in December. What the alternate timeline changes is the duration and the frame, how many more October entries there are, and what narrative, if any, eventually closes the notebook. The limited edition of 300 copies, published in Osaka in 1968, was produced, according to the family's preface, because Hara told them before he died that he wanted the notebook to exist somewhere outside the family. He lived until the early 1970s, working at a textile factory, taking his pension, occupying a small apartment not far from where he had been born. He didn't talk about China, his family says. He didn't join veterans organizations. He had kept the notebook through the war, through the surrender, through the repatriation, and through the decades that followed. He didn't throw it away. He didn't burn it. He kept it in a drawer. And eventually he said he wanted it to exist somewhere other than a drawer. And his family had 300 copies printed. 300 copies. It received 1 academic review. In the alternate timeline, where the Pacific War begins later or differently, where the China War is perhaps the defining military fact of Japan's national experience for another decade, where no single catastrophic defeat provides the symbolic break that the actual Pacific War's ending eventually gave Japan. In that timeline, there are a great many more notebooks, and most of them are in drawers. Chapter 11. Britain's Lonely War. The evening of December 7th, 1941, at Chequers, the Prime Minister's official country residence in the Chiltern Hills of Buckinghamshire. Winston Churchill was at dinner. The radio was on in the adjacent room. A BBC broadcast described the Japanese attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. John Colville, Churchill's private secretary, who kept a detailed diary throughout his years in Downing Street, published decades later, recorded what happened next. Churchill stood up immediately. He said something to the effect that Britain would declare war on Japan. Then, after a pause, he said they had won the war. Colville noted that he had never in his life seen a man so visibly, physically relieved. Churchill went upstairs, and by his own account in his memoirs, written in the early 1950s, he slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. Strip away the famous speeches, the iron rhetoric about fighting on the beaches in the finest hour, the public performances of indomitable resolve. And this is what you find underneath on December 7th. A man who had known, with the precise knowledge of a professional politician who had been doing the arithmetic every morning for 2 years, that Britain alone could not win the war it was fighting. Pearl Harbor was, to Winston Churchill, a deliverance. Now imagine that the radio announces nothing from Pearl Harbor that evening. Churchill goes to bed saved by nothing. He sleeps, if he sleeps, as a man still unsaved. The arithmetic Churchill had been doing every morning since the fall of France in June of 1940 was not abstract. It was specific and grim. Britain's population in 1941 was approximately 49 million. Germany's, including Austria and the Sudetenland, was roughly 90 million. The Soviet Union's was approximately 190 million. And the USSR was fighting for its survival on the Eastern Front. The United States had a population of approximately 132 million, and an industrial economy that had already, through Lend-Lease, demonstrated its capacity to produce weapons and supplies at rates that dwarfed British production. Britain's fighting strength in the Middle East, in the Atlantic, and in the air over its own cities was real. Its capacity for sustained offensive operations against a Germany that had not yet begun to fracture was not. Churchill understood this. He understood it so precisely that his October 19, 1941 cable to Roosevelt, in which he described British survival as dependent on American entry no later than spring of 1942, was not diplomatic pressure. It was a professional military assessment written by a former First Lord of the Admiralty, who had been reading casualty reports every morning for 16 months. The Battle of the Atlantic is where British strategic survival is most immediately and concretely at risk in the alternate timeline. In actual history, American naval entry into the Atlantic War in December of 1941 brought substantial reinforcement to convoy escort operations. American destroyers, patrol aircraft, and the Coast Guard's cutters joined the Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy in mid-Atlantic convoy protection. American shipyards produced replacement merchant tonnage at rates that eventually outran German U-boat sinkings. American-designed radar and American-manufactured anti-submarine weapons, including the Hedgehog forward-firing mortar, deployed extensively on American escort vessels, contributed to the rising U-boat kill rate that turned the Battle of the Atlantic in the Allies' favor by the spring of 1943. Without American entry in December of 1941, the operational reinforcement of Atlantic convoy escort doesn't arrive in the critical winter of 1941-42. Admiral Karl Donitz's submarines, which in actual history were largely redirected to American coastal waters in January of 1942, instead remained concentrated against mid-Atlantic convoy lanes. The consequences for British merchant shipping are significant. Each additional merchant vessel sunk represents roughly 6,000 to 8,000 tons of cargo, food, fuel, raw materials, and weapons that doesn't reach Britain. Germany's U-boats sank approximately 1,664 Allied merchant vessels in 1942 in actual history, representing roughly 7.8 million gross registered tons of shipping. British shipyards were not able to replace these losses at pace. It was American industrial capacity that closed the gap. The Liberty Ship program, the mass-produced standard cargo vessels built in American yards using prefabricated sections, with a hull being completed every 42 days at peak production, was the industrial answer to the submarine crisis. At peak production in 1943, American yards were delivering approximately 2,800 Liberty ships per year. Each Liberty ship displaced approximately 14,000 tons, and carried approximately 10,000 tons of cargo at standard loading. Without Pearl Harbor creating the wartime industrial urgency that drove this production program, Liberty ship output in early 1942 is lower. The mathematical margin between ships sunk and ships built narrows uncomfortably. The British Eighth Army in North Africa represents a different dimension of the same problem. By the autumn of 1941, the Army was equipped partly with American Lend-Lease materiel, Matilda and Valentine infantry tanks, Stuart light tanks, General Grant medium tanks just beginning to arrive in theater, along with American trucks that provided the logistical mobility the British Army's own vehicle production couldn't fully supply. Rommel, in his February 1942 diary entries published posthumously in the Rommel Papers, noted the appearance of American vehicles and equipment in British formations with specific concern, calculating correctly that the American supply pipeline represented a qualitative and quantitative improvement in British operational capacity that would, if it continued to grow, eventually tilt the balance of the Desert Campaign decisively against the Africa Corps. But the Eighth Army was fighting without American soldiers. Its manpower pool was finite. For every battalion destroyed in the Western Desert, there was a specific British town, in Yorkshire, in Scotland, in East Anglia, whose draft-eligible male population had just become permanently and irrevocably smaller. Operation Torch, the Anglo-American landings in Northwest Africa in November of 1942, was the event that eventually sealed the North African campaign's outcome. 107,000 American troops in the first landing wave, followed by the gradual buildup that eventually put American formations on Rommel's western flank, while the Eighth Army pressed from the east. Churchill had wanted this operation from the beginning. American General George Marshall had opposed it, preferring a direct cross-channel invasion in 1943. Roosevelt overruled Marshall and chose Torch, partly to ensure that American soldiers were fighting in 1942 somewhere. Without Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt has no political cover to overrule Marshall. Without Torch's first wave of 107,000 Americans, there is no pincer movement. Without the pincer, Rommel's position in North Africa is under pressure from the east, but not enveloped. The Desert Campaign extends. Its outcome is less certain. To me, the most revealing document in the Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence from this period isn't the formal diplomatic cables or the famous speeches. It's the October 19, 1941 message from Churchill to Roosevelt, in which Churchill, with extraordinary care, described a situation he couldn't quite describe directly. He used the word untenable about the strategic position in the Mediterranean if American entry didn't materialize. He suggested that certain Atlantic events might provide the occasion that political circumstances required. He was, in the language of prime ministers communicating with presidents in democratic countries, asking Roosevelt to engineer the war declaration that his own Congress wouldn't give him. Roosevelt replied warmly and non-committally. The performance continued. Pearl Harbor ended the performance for both of them. Without it, the performance would have continued into 1942, against a reality that was, by any honest accounting, becoming harder to dress as anything other than what it was. The India question complicates the alternate timeline's British picture in ways that the European theater alone doesn't capture. The Indian National Congress under Gandhi and Nehru had been pressing for independence throughout the war years, with the Quit India movement launched in August of 1942, in actual history, representing a peak of civil disobedience that required the British government to arrest roughly 60,000 Congress activists and deploy British and Indian Army units to suppress. The Indian Army, approximately 2.5 million men under arms by 1943 in actual history, was the primary ground force for British operations in North Africa, the Middle East, Burma, and eventually Western Europe. Its loyalty to the British Crown was not unconditional. It was the product of specific political understandings, specific officer relationships, and the specific wartime context that gave Indian soldiers a clear enemy and a clear purpose. In the alternate timeline, where Japan's southern advance creates pressure on British India without the clarity of a formal Pacific Wars declaration, the political situation in India is more ambiguous. The Congress Party's demand for independence doesn't disappear. The British government's ability to suppress it without the argument of total wartime necessity is weaker. Churchill's December crossing of the Atlantic in actual history, sailing on the battleship HMS Duke of York to meet Roosevelt in Washington for the Arcadia Conference, was the meeting at which Germany first was formalized as Allied strategic doctrine. Churchill brought his arguments to Washington already written, prepared before he left Britain, because he was confident of two things: that the alliance was secure, and that Roosevelt might need persuading to prioritize Europe over the Pacific War that Pearl Harbor had just triggered. The meeting produced the combined chiefs of staff structure, the unified command architecture, and the strategic consensus that governed Allied operations for the next 3.5 years. Without Pearl Harbor, Churchill makes no such crossing in December of 1941. The Arcadia Conference doesn't happen. Germany first, never formally ratified by treaty, always dependent on mutual agreement and personal trust, is never formalized. The two wars, European and Pacific, remain legally and strategically separate, managed by parallel rather than integrated command structures, funded by separate appropriations, and contested in Washington by officers who haven't been given the framework that the actual Arcadia Conference provided. The war that eventually comes to Britain's aid in this alternate 1942 comes less coherently, less completely, and more slowly. Chapter 12. Midway never happens. The 4th of June, 1942, roughly 320 kilometers northwest of the Midway Atoll in the Central Pacific. At approximately 10:22 in the morning local time, 3 American SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise rolled into their attack dives on the Japanese fleet carrier Kaga. At almost the same moment, other Dauntlesses from the Enterprise and the USS Yorktown were rolling on to the Akagi and the Soryu. Within roughly 5 minutes of those attacks beginning, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers at Midway were on fire and mortally damaged. The 4th, Hiryu, survived until late afternoon before aircraft from the Enterprise found her too. By nightfall on the 4th of June, Japan had lost 4 carriers and approximately 3,000 men, including somewhere between 200 and 300 experienced carrier aviators and aircrew. The Battle of Midway was the most decisive naval engagement since Trafalgar, and in the alternate timeline where Pearl Harbor never happened, the 4th of June, 1942, is an ordinary Tuesday in the Central Pacific. No carriers, no dive bombers, no 5 minutes that changed the war. Midway is a small atoll with a weather station, a small garrison, and a notable population of Laysan albatrosses. Nothing happens there at 10:22 in the morning. Midway happened in actual history because Pearl Harbor happened first. The logical chain between them runs directly and requires no gaps. Yamamoto attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. The attack was operationally successful. It destroyed the Pacific Fleet's battleship force, and strategically incomplete, because the American carriers were at sea and survived. Yamamoto then spent the first months of 1942 designing the decisive engagement that Pearl Harbor had failed to deliver. His Midway plan was an attempt to seize the atoll and threaten Hawaii, forcing the American carriers out of Pearl Harbor to respond, where they could be destroyed by Kido Butai in the set-piece engagement that Kantai-Kessen Doctrine demanded. Without Pearl Harbor, the entire logical sequence that produced Midway doesn't exist. Yamamoto doesn't need Midway because he hasn't committed to the strategy that made Midway necessary. The Kantai-Kessen Doctrine he would have returned to, the defensive, reactive, decisive battle framework, doesn't require provocative operations in the Central Pacific. It requires patience, positioning, and the willingness to let the Americans come to him. Yamamoto's personal genius was always for the offensive. In the alternate timeline, the institutional navy he's operating within keeps that genius on a shorter leash. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his combat intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, Station Hypo, were the intelligence operation that made Midway possible in actual history. Rochefort's team had been working for months on the Japanese Navy's operational code, designated JN-25, and in the spring of 1942, achieved sufficient penetration to identify the Japanese designation AF as referring to Midway Atoll. The identification was confirmed by the famous freshwater ruse. Midway was instructed to transmit a false radio message reporting its water distillation plant had failed, and within 2 days, a Japanese intelligence message appeared reporting that AF was short of fresh water. Rochefort used this intelligence to give Admiral Chester Nimitz the precise location and approximate timing of the Japanese fleet's movements. Nimitz ambushed Nagumo. Without the intelligence, without the ambush, the battle is fought differently. without Pearl Harbor creating the wartime emergency that accelerated American code-breaking operations and gave them the resources and priority they needed, Station Hypo's capabilities developed more slowly. The JN-25 penetration that was partially accomplished by June of 1942 in actual history might be 6 months to a year behind schedule in the alternate timeline. Japan's 6 fleet carriers in the alternate timeline carry their full complement of experienced aircrew through the summer of 1942 and beyond. The Midway attrition didn't just sink 4 ships. It killed approximately 3,000 men, including a cohort of carrier aviators, whose individual experience was, by any objective measure, the finest in any naval air force in the world in mid-1942. The precise number of experienced carrier pilots lost at Midway is debated. Some accounts suggest the actual aircrew losses were lower than sometimes claimed, with many pilots rescued from the carriers before they sank, while others point to the losses in the air fighting as the more significant human capital destruction. What isn't debated is the trajectory. The attrition chain from Coral Sea in May, through Midway in June, through the Guadalcanal campaign, from August of 1942 through February of 1943, was the mechanism that reduced Japanese carrier aviation from qualitative superiority to functional parity with the Americans, and then to inferiority within 18 months. Japan's pilot training program was producing roughly 100 carrier-qualified aviators per year by 1942. The experience cohort it lost through that 18-month period was not recoverable at that production rate. In the alternate timeline, without the chain beginning, the cohort is intact. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat's limitations against the Zero are precise enough to be worth specifying in detail, because they define the tactical problem that the alternate timeline's American carrier pilots are still working to solve. The Wildcat had a maximum speed of approximately 318 miles per hour at altitude, compared to the Zero's 332. It could sustain perhaps 1,500 feet per minute in a zoom climb before aerodynamic limits forced it level, compared to the Zero's approximately 3,000 feet per minute initial climb rate. In a turning fight at medium altitude, the standard dogfight scenario of 1941 and early 42, the Zero could outturn the Wildcat with a turn radius advantage of roughly 30%, meaning a Wildcat pilot who attempted to follow a Zero through a turn would find himself falling behind and ultimately presented as a target. Lieutenant Commander John S. Thatch had developed his beam defense position, later called the Thatch Weave, in the spring of 1941, using matchboxes on a table to work out the geometry, without having yet fought a Zero in combat. He first employed it effectively at Midway on the 4th of June, 1942, where his 6 Wildcats held off approximately 30 Zeros during the torpedo bomber attacks, and achieved a kill ratio their aircraft specifications shouldn't have allowed. Without Midway, without the specific crucible where the tactic was first proven under fire, its operational adoption across the carrier fleet is slower, more tentative, less urgent. American pilots flying against intact, experienced Japanese air groups in the alternate timeline's opening carrier engagements are doing so without the tested, combat-proven tactical solution that Midway produced. The Essex class is the other side of this equation, and it needs its own paragraph because it represents the industrial variable that the alternate timeline can't suppress indefinitely. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, was commissioned in December of 1942 in actual history, a product of the wartime shipbuilding acceleration that Pearl Harbor had triggered. The Essex class was, by any reasonable measure, the finest fleet carrier design of the Second World War, displacing approximately 27,000 tons at standard load, capable of carrying between 90 and 100 aircraft, with a maximum speed of 33 knots, a flight deck 872 feet long, and a designed capability for sustained offensive operations at fleet scale. The United States built 24 Essex-class carriers during the war. Japan built 0 fleet carriers of comparable size and capability during the same period. The Taiho, Japan's most capable carrier completed during the war, was a single ship, commissioned in March of 1944. The industrial comparison is categorical and not recoverable by any tactical or strategic innovation Japan could have produced. By 1943 or 1944 in the alternate timeline, regardless of Pearl Harbor's non-occurrence, the Essex-class carriers are entering the Pacific in numbers that Kido Butai, even intact, even fully crewed, cannot match. The question is what happens between late 1942 and late 1943. That intermediate period, with its undamaged Japanese carriers and their experienced pilots, against a U.S. Navy that is still converting from battleship to carrier doctrine, is where the alternate Pacific War's opening chapters are written. When I look at the Midway battle records, specifically Roosevelt's annotated intelligence cables in the National Archives, the handwritten margin notes beside the decoded JN-25 traffic, I find myself thinking about the role of luck in distinguishing a brilliant operation from a catastrophe. Nimitz's decision to accept Roosevelt's intelligence assessment over the counter-assessment of Admiral Robert English, who believed the Japanese target was the Aleutians, was not a casual choice. Nimitz was betting the entire Pacific carrier force on Roosevelt's reading of partial intelligence. If Roosevelt was wrong, the American carriers would be at Midway when Japan attacked Hawaii or Alaska, out of position, unable to respond. Nimitz accepted the intelligence and acted on it. The result was Midway. In the alternate timeline, without the specific intelligence architecture that Pearl Harbor's urgency had built, without the specific operational experience of Station Hypo that the preceding 6 months of actual Pacific War had generated, Nimitz doesn't have the same quality of intelligence to bet on. The fog of war in the alternate Pacific is thicker. The decisive engagement, if it comes, is more genuinely uncertain. The Battle of Midway cost Japan approximately 3,000 men and 4 fleet carriers representing roughly 102,000 tons of warships. In the alternate timeline, those 102,000 tons are still afloat in June of 1942. But as I argued earlier in discussing the pilots, the tonnage is less significant than the people. The 4 carriers could theoretically be replaced. Japan had carriers under construction. The pilots could not be replaced on any realistic timeline. The people in that armored cockpit above the Pacific on the 4th of June were the product of a training and selection system that had been operating since the early 1930s, filtering Japan's naval aviators through a process so rigorous that it produced, by the late 1930s, roughly 100 combat-ready carrier pilots per year from a pool of several thousand applicants. You cannot accelerate that system by 3 or 4 years simply by increasing the training budget. The judgment, the reflexes, the specific combat cognition that keeps a pilot alive in a turning engagement. These build through time and through experience that cannot be compressed. In the alternate timeline, all of them are alive through the summer of 1942. They are flying zero variants with performance advantages over anything the Americans have in the air. They are operating from 6 undamaged carriers. They are the most dangerous naval aviation force in the Pacific, and the war that must eventually be fought against them is going to take longer and cost more than the one that actually happened. Chapter 13, The Manhattan Project's Alternate Calendar. The 6th of December, 1941, the day before Pearl Harbor. A meeting of senior scientists and administrators from the Office of Scientific Research and Development convened in Washington to discuss the uranium program's status. They reviewed a report from Arthur Compton at the University of Chicago, assessing the feasibility of an atomic weapon, discussed procurement timelines for enriched uranium, and considered the program's current priority ranking relative to other wartime scientific projects. The meeting was orderly and productive. It produced recommendations. It did not produce a sense of emergency. The following day, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor occurred. 11 days after that, on the 18th of December, 1941, the S-1 Committee, the top policy committee for the uranium program, held its first formal meeting. The minutes of that meeting, preserved in the program's official history and discussed in subsequent scholarly accounts, described the meeting's atmosphere as pervaded by enthusiasm and urgency. The enthusiasm was real. The urgency was new. It had arrived 11 days earlier from Hawaii. Without the attack, that urgency doesn't arrive. The meeting on the 18th of December is a different meeting. The Manhattan Project that follows is a different project. The British had done the theoretical groundwork that made the American decision concrete. The MAUD Committee, a group of British nuclear physicists, convened in the spring of 1940 to assess the feasibility of an atomic weapon, had produced its final report in July of 1941, and the report was shared with American scientists that autumn. The MAUD report's conclusions were unambiguous by the standards of wartime scientific documents. A uranium-235 bomb using a critical mass of between 2 and 15 kilograms was technically feasible, could be produced within 2 to 3 years with adequate resources, and would have a blast yield equivalent to approximately 1,800 tons of TNT. This was not speculation. The physics underlying the conclusion had been worked out in detail, with specific calculations for the critical mass, the initiator mechanism, and the engineering challenges of assembly. Vannevar Bush had read the MAUD report. Roosevelt had been briefed on it in October of 1941, when Bush presented the report's conclusions and requested guidance on whether to proceed with a serious development program. Roosevelt authorized preliminary steps. He did not authorize a crash program. There was a difference, and Pearl Harbor eliminated it. On the 28th of December, 1942, 13 months after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt signed the formal authorization for the full industrial program that became the Manhattan Project. This is the specific date on which the government committed to spending what ultimately exceeded $2 billion, constructing the secret cities of Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington State, and Los Alamos in New Mexico, and employing more than 130,000 people in a classified industrial effort whose scale was concealed from the majority of Congress, most of the cabinet, and, for a significant period, the Vice President of the United States. The industrial operations required to enrich uranium to weapon-grade purity, the electromagnetic separation calutrons at Oak Ridge's Y-12 plant, designed by Ernest Lawrence, consumed electricity at a rate that required a direct connection to the Tennessee Valley Authority's public power grid. They also required approximately 14,700 tons of silver, borrowed from the United States Treasury, to serve as electrical conductor, substituting for copper, that was a controlled military material. These were decisions that required wartime political authority. A government that is not at war borrows silver from its own treasury for a secret physics experiment only if there is a sufficiently compelling reason. Pearl Harbor was that reason. The S-1 Committee's 18th December meeting is the pivot point. In actual history, that meeting took place in an atmosphere of enthusiasm and urgency. The phrase comes from a description of the meeting in the official Manhattan Project history. Lawrence requested $400,000 for electromagnetic separation research. The committee immediately approved it. In the preceding 6 months, similar requests had moved more slowly through the bureaucratic process. Before Pearl Harbor, the uranium program competed for priority with every other wartime scientific project. After Pearl Harbor, it was given a separate status that allowed it to bypass normal procurement and authorization procedures. What Pearl Harbor provided was not the idea of the bomb. That existed before the attack. What it provided was the political and administrative clarity that allowed the idea to become an industrial program. The idea needs the clarity to become the weapon. Without the clarity, the idea continues to develop, but at a rate determined by normal, peacetime bureaucratic processes, rather than by the emergency logic of total war. I want to be honest about the counterfactual's limits here, because it's easy to overstate the dependence. Even before Pearl Harbor, the Roosevelt administration was funding uranium research through the National Defense Research Committee at a rate that would have eventually produced a serious development program. The MAUD report had already convinced the American scientific establishment, Compton, Lawrence, Fermi, Oppenheimer, that the weapon was feasible. The political machinery of the American federal government was already moving, however slowly, toward a formal program. The scholar Alex Wellerstein, who has researched the administrative history of the program in detail, has argued that Pearl Harbor accelerated the timeline rather than created it, that a crash program of some kind was probably inevitable, but that without the attack, its commencement date might have been late 1942 rather than late 1941, and its full industrial authorization might have come in 1943 rather than 1942. 6 months to a year of delay, compounded across a 3-year development program, produces a first weapon in late 1946 or early 1947, rather than July of 1945. The bomb exists. The war it was designed to end may not exist in the same form. The Manhattan Project's material requirements illuminate its dependence on wartime industrial authority in ways that pure cost figures don't fully capture. Uranium ore was the foundational material, and its principal wartime source was the Shinkolobwe mine in the Belgian Congo, operated by Union Minière du Haut-Katanga. The key figure in securing the ore was a Belgian-American businessman named Edgar Sengier, who had, before the American program existed, moved approximately 1,200 tons of uranium ore to a warehouse in Staten Island, New York, as a precautionary measure against the German occupation of Belgium making the ore inaccessible. Sengier had no particular reason to do this except professional prudence. He was aware that uranium had potential scientific applications, and he did not want the ore to fall under German control. When American program officers came looking for uranium ore in the autumn of 1942, Sengier told them he had 1,200 tons already in Staten Island. The ore was there. It was in New York. It had been sitting in a warehouse for 2 years, waiting for someone to ask. That specific act of individual foresight, completely unrelated to any government program, was one of the Manhattan Project's first critical material inputs. In the alternate timeline, Sengier's warehouse is still full. The ore is still there. The Americans come looking for it later and find it in the same condition. The uranium question is not the binding constraint. The actual binding constraint in the alternate timeline is the industrial program itself, the gaseous diffusion plant, the electromagnetic separation plant, the plutonium reactors, the weapons laboratory. Each of these requires classified construction contracts, emergency procurement authority, priority allocation of strategic materials including copper, steel, and electrical power, and the ability to operate outside the normal congressional oversight mechanisms that peacetime government requires. In the spring of 1942, in actual history, the Army Corps of Engineers took over the program's administration, specifically because military authority provided the procurement and security powers that a civilian agency couldn't easily exercise. Without a declared war, the Army Corps of Engineers has no jurisdiction over a civilian scientific research program. The alternative, operating through civilian channels with wartime scale requirements, is possible, but slower and more exposed. The secret of the program is harder to keep without the classification authority that military administration provides. The program's pace is slower without the procurement priority that declared war creates. The weapon arrives later. The Soviet nuclear program sits in the background of this calculation and is never far from the foreground when you think about the alternate timeline's post-war world. Soviet intelligence penetration of the Manhattan Project, through Klaus Fuchs, Theodore Hall, and others, provided Moscow with detailed technical information about the gun-type uranium device and the implosion-type plutonium device, accelerating the Soviet program's development significantly. Igor Kurchatov, leading the Soviet program, used this information to guide his own research in ways that reduced his team's development time by an estimated 1 to 2 years. In actual history, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear device in August of 1949, approximately 4 years after the American Trinity test. In the alternate timeline, with the American program delayed by a year or more, the intelligence gap between American and Soviet development narrows. Kurchatov is still receiving intelligence from his American sources. He is still developing the bomb at his own pace, informed by what the Americans are doing. If the American bomb arrives in late 1946 or early 1947, the Soviet bomb might follow in 1949 or 1950, nearly simultaneously in nuclear strategic terms. The window of American nuclear monopoly that in actual history lasted from July of 1945 to August of 1949 is compressed or eliminated in the alternate timeline. 2 nuclear-armed states arriving at the post-war world within a year or 2 of each other, without the structured allied relationship that the actual wartime coalition had built, in a world where the United Nations either doesn't exist or exists in a weaker form. This is the picture at the back of the chapter that the weapons program is building toward without quite arriving at. The 18th of December, 1941, the S-1 committee meets in Washington. In actual history, the meeting is described as full of enthusiasm and urgency. The urgency had arrived 11 days earlier. In the alternate timeline, the same group of scientists and administrators meets on the 18th of December in a room where the urgency hasn't arrived yet, because Pearl Harbor hasn't happened. They review the Maud report's conclusions. They discuss enrichment timelines and critical mass calculations. They make recommendations. They are not wrong in their recommendations. The physics is the same. But the room is different. The pace is different. The decision to commit $2 billion and 130,000 people to this specific program on this specific timeline requires a political context that the 18th of December 1941, without Pearl Harbor, simply doesn't yet have. The weapon eventually gets built, but eventually is doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and the world it arrives in may not need it in the same way, or be able to use it in the same way, or be able to contain it in the same way. That uncertainty is where the alternate history ends, and where the real historical questions begin. Chapter 14. Germany's Long War. On the 14th of February, 1942, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel filed a supply request from his forward headquarters at Tamimi, Libya, a document that tells you more about the alternate history we're examining than almost any other single piece of paper in this story. He needed 6,000 tons of supplies to continue his offensive. He received fewer than 3,000. Rommel's Africa Corps, 7 divisions strong, officially required 70,000 tons of materiel per month to sustain operations. Across the Mediterranean, Italian convoys, slow, unescorted, perpetually targeted by the Royal Navy from Malta, were delivering perhaps half that. The shortfall wasn't incompetence, it was arithmetic. And that arithmetic changes entirely in a world where Japan never struck Pearl Harbor, where the United States remains out of the war, and where Britain stands without an American partner to eventually shoulder the burden of resupply. What Rommel needed in North Africa was Lend-Lease. What he faced instead was physics. In the real war, the British 8th Army received 167 American M3 Grant tanks before the Battle of Gazala in May 1942, each one mounting a 75mm gun capable of killing a Panzer III at 800 meters. A figure that shook German tank crews who'd grown accustomed to outgunning their opponents. The Grant weighed 29 tons, carried a crew of 6, and burned roughly 1 gallon of fuel per mile. Its arrival didn't win Gazala. Rommel still triumphed there. But it bought time. Without Pearl Harbor triggering American belligerence, without Lend-Lease flowing into British armored units at the rate it actually did, the 8th Army faces Rommel in the Western Desert with Crusader tanks, 33 centimeters of frontal armor, a 2-pounder gun, and a suspension system that mechanics at the 8th Army's 4th Armored Brigade famously described in November 1941 as structurally optimistic. That's not a minor technical footnote. It's the difference between holding the line at El Alamein and not. I want to be careful here about the trap of inevitability. It's tempting to write a clean line from no Pearl Harbor to Germany wins in Africa. But the reality is messier and more instructive. Britain was already receiving Lend-Lease from March 1941. The program didn't require American belligerence to function, only American willingness, and that willingness existed under the Lend-Lease Act, signed by Roosevelt on the 11th of March, 1941. What Pearl Harbor changed wasn't the pipeline itself, but its intensity, its political protection, and the addition of American troops to the fighting force. In our counterfactual, without a Japanese attack, the America First Committee's 800,000 members remain politically active and vocally opposed to any further entanglement. Senator Arthur Vandenberg of Michigan, who in real life reversed his isolationism the moment he heard the news from Pearl Harbor, writing in his diary that, "In my mind, the argument was over," remains in December 1941 exactly what he was in November. The Senate's most formidable barrier against intervention. Roosevelt's ability to push Lend-Lease deliveries to their war-footing levels collapses without that galvanizing moment. What happens to Rommel without American troops, American trucks, and American political will? He almost certainly takes the Suez Canal. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought in October and November of 1942, was won by Bernard Montgomery with over 1,000 tanks, 530 of them American-built M4 Shermans and M3 Grants. Rommel, by contrast, had 200 gun-armed tanks, and critically was starved for fuel. He'd told his superiors he couldn't advance without 6,000 tons of fuel promised him, and received far less. In our alternate scenario, the Grant and Sherman shipments don't arrive in the quantities they did. British armored strength is meaningfully lower, and the political pressure on Churchill to negotiate, already acute after the fall of Tobruk in June 1942, a moment that genuinely shook British confidence, grows measurably stronger. The fall of Tobruk cost the British 33,000 prisoners, and produced in Winston Churchill, then in Washington, what he later described as one of the most painful moments of the entire war. Multiply that pain across a longer, grinding campaign without American relief, and you have a British public and political class increasingly asking what exactly is being won, and at what cost. The Eastern Front tells a parallel story, and this is where the alternate timeline gets truly vertiginous. American lend-lease to the Soviet Union totaled more than $11 billion by the war's end, and the most operationally decisive component wasn't aircraft or tanks, it was trucks. The United States shipped over 400,000 trucks and jeeps to the Red Army, most of them Studebaker US 6 Deuce and a half, 2.5-ton vehicles whose six-wheel drive made them exceptional on the muddy, frozen Soviet road network. Marshal Georgy Zhukov told Eisenhower after the war that without American trucks, the Soviet Union could not have sustained the offensives that broke the German army in the East. Without Pearl Harbor, those trucks still flow. Lend-lease is already operational by the time of the counterfactual's divergence point in December 1941. But there's a significant caveat. Without America at war, domestic political resistance to Soviet lend-lease intensifies. Congressional committees already skeptical of aiding a communist state become more emboldened as the America First movement remains intact. The precise flow of 400,000 trucks and 8,000 tractors and 14,000 aircraft was sustained by the political momentum of a nation at war. Without that momentum, the river slows. The Battle of Stalingrad is perhaps the starkest test case. Between the 17th of July, 1942, and the 2nd of February, 1943, a German Sixth Army of approximately 300,000 men fought its way into, and was then encircled within, the ruined city on the Volga. The Sixth Army needed 500 tons of supplies daily, once surrounded. The Luftwaffe's airlift, between the 24th of November and the surrender, managed an average of 116 tons per day, 100 tons on good days, 60 on bad ones. The Sixth Army's final casualties were 147,000 killed and wounded, and 91,000 captured, of whom only 5,000 would eventually return to Germany. Those figures are almost unchanged in our counterfactual, because the trucks and rail supplies that enabled the Soviet counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, the November pincer that encircled the Sixth Army, were already flowing under lend-lease routes established before Pearl Harbor. What changes is what comes after Stalingrad. In the real war, the Soviet momentum of early 1943 is eventually backed by an enormous American materiel surge, timed to American full belligerence. In our alternate, that surge is politically uncertain, and the Wehrmacht has more opportunity to trade space for time. The Wannsee Conference of the 20th of January, 1942, is a difficult data point to hold in the same analytical frame as supply tonnage and tank specifications. 15 senior Nazi officials gathered in a villa on the shore of Lake Wannsee in Berlin and coordinated the administrative machinery for the systematic murder of 11 million European Jews. Its proceedings took perhaps 90 minutes. No historical counterfactual of this period can responsibly avoid the question of what a longer German war means for that program. The honest answer is bleak and speculative in equal measure. The extermination program was already underway before the Wannsee meeting, having begun in earnest in occupied Soviet territory during the summer of 1941. What Wannsee codified was coordination, not initiation. A longer war, without American troops to open a second front in North Africa, and eventually in France, almost certainly extends the operational window in which the machinery functions. The number of European Jews murdered, 6 million, a figure that has both statistical precision and moral incomprehensibility, becomes, in this counterfactual, potentially larger. I find it necessary to write that directly, and equally necessary to resist using it as a dramatic device. It's the weight the rest of this alternate timeline carries. There's a document in the German Federal Archives that researchers rarely quote because it's mundane in the wrong way. It's a supply manifest from Rommel's quartermaster, dated the 27th of October, 1942, 4 days into the Second Battle of El Alamein. It lists, among other things, the fuel status of every German armored unit in theater. Panzer Regiment 8 had fuel for 87 kilometers. Panzer Regiment 5 had fuel for 61 kilometers. Rommel had planned an armored counterattack. He couldn't execute it. The tanks sat. That document is the physical residue of a logistics problem, rooted, ultimately, in the strategic overextension that Pearl Harbor and American entry eventually ended by giving the Allied side more of everything. More ships to suppress the Mediterranean convoys from Malta, more production capacity to replace losses, more troops to open new fronts. Without that counterweight, the manifest for the 27th of October might read differently. It might not contain the word insufficient in column 14, but it would likely read that way sooner or later, and the damage done between those two dates is incalculable. I keep returning, in my own reading of this period, to a detail that doesn't appear in supply manifests or casualty reports. In the diary of Private Second Class Hans Wilhelm Schroeder of the 15th Panzer Division, written during the retreat from El Alamein in early November 1942, there's a sentence that reads, "We are moving west again, and no one explains why." He had no idea about the fuel figures in Rommel's quartermaster files. He knew only that the tanks were going the wrong direction. That sentence, written in pencil in a field notebook recovered from a prisoner exchange, is what makes the logistics real. In our alternate timeline, where America has stayed home, where Britain faces the Desert War alone, where the trucks are fewer and the grants arrive later, Private Schroeder might not be retreating in November 1942. The direction of the tank tracks changes, and with it, everything. The question this chapter leaves open isn't whether Germany would have won. The weight of scholarship, from Richard Overy's Why the Allies Won to Adam Tooze's The Wages of Destruction, suggests Germany's fundamental economic and industrial constraints would have ultimately prevailed against it, even without American intervention. What's genuinely uncertain is the timeline and the human cost of the difference. In the war that actually happened, Germany surrendered on the 8th of May, 1945. In a war where America stayed home through 1942, that date slides. By months or by years, no one can honestly say. The supply manifests tell you the arithmetic. They don't tell you whose sons fill the casualty lists in the extra months. There's a Wehrmacht payroll record from the Army Personnel Office in Berlin, dated January 1st, 1943, that lists 712,000 active German casualties since the start of the Stalingrad campaign. In the archive, someone has circled that number in red pencil. Nobody knows who. Nobody knows why. Chapter 15. The Sleeping Giant Refuses to Wake. The morning of the 8th of December, 1941, the morning that, in the world as it happened, Franklin Roosevelt walked to the rostrum of a joint session of Congress and delivered 31 sentences that changed the trajectory of human history, begins in our alternate timeline with nothing. No emergency session, no gallery packed with senators and representatives and 3 Supreme Court justices, no First Lady in the gallery, hands folded, no radio silence broken by the voice of a president telling 230 million Americans that a date which will live in infamy has just written their futures for them. That morning, in the alternate, begins like any other Washington morning in late autumn. Cold, gray, the Potomac running dark under a 17-degree sky. The Capitol's dome lit against pre-dawn darkness for the cleaning crews who start at 5:15. The silence isn't peace. It's a held breath with no release. Roosevelt's problem, in this counterfactual, is that he has been trying to find that release for nearly 2 years. His administration had been conducting a slow, deliberate, legally tortured entry into the European war since at least the summer of 1940. Lend-Lease, in March 1941, the Atlantic Charter, signed in secret on the cruiser Augusta off Newfoundland on the 14th of August, 1941, while press and Congress believed Roosevelt was on a fishing vacation. The September 1941 shoot-on-sight order, authorizing U.S. Navy ships to fire on Axis vessels in American defensive waters, an order so close to an act of war that Senator Vandenberg called it, accurately, the most momentous declaration ever made by a president without prior approval by Congress. Each step had been calibrated. Each had been met with fierce opposition. And each had moved the United States precisely one increment closer to a belligerency it could not quite reach without an attack that came from the other side. Without Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's incremental strategy runs out of increments. The Gallup polling data from the fourth quarter of 1941 is instructive and sobering. In October 1941, 68% of Americans opposed sending a U.S. Army to fight in Europe. 52% supported aid to Britain short of actual war. But short of actual war was doing enormous work in that sentence. The America First Committee, at its October 19, 41 peak, had 800,000 dues-paying members, organized into 450 chapters across the country. Its most prominent spokesperson, Charles Lindbergh, the most famous American alive in 1940, the man who had crossed the Atlantic solo in 33 hours and 30 minutes in 1927, had addressed a Madison Square Garden rally in May 1941 and drawn a crowd of 22,000. The committee's fundraising operation had raised $370,000 in its first year. It wasn't a fringe movement. It was a mainstream political coalition, with access to Senate floor time, newspaper editorial pages, and a public that had lost over 100,000 men in the previous war, and was not eager to lose more. The question historians have debated since the 1960s is whether Roosevelt could have found another path to belligerency, another incident, another provocation, another sinking of the Maine that could substitute for Pearl Harbor as a catalytic shock. The evidence is mixed, and the debate remains genuinely unresolved. Some scholars, including Robert Stinnett in Day of Deceit, have argued that Roosevelt deliberately maneuvered Japan into attacking, a thesis that most historians reject, but that illuminates how desperate Roosevelt's strategic situation actually was. The conventional view, represented by scholars like Gordon Prang and David Kahn, is that Roosevelt wanted to enter the war, but had no reliable mechanism to do so over the will of the American public. The Atlantic Charter committed the United States to a post-war vision of democratic self-determination. It did not commit a single American soldier to defending it. Without Pearl Harbor, the Charter remains what Churchill feared it might always be, a statement of aspirations rather than a declaration of intention. In the Senate, December 1941, the arithmetic of intervention is punishing. The Neutrality Acts of the 1930s had been progressively chipped away. Roosevelt amended the Neutrality Act in November 1941 to allow American merchant ships to arm themselves and enter war zones. But the core prohibition on direct military involvement remained politically untouchable. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana, one of the most effective isolationist voices in the chamber, had described Lend-Lease in January 1941 as a plan to plow under every fourth American boy. That line had landed. Wheeler's constituency didn't care about the distance from Butte to Berlin. They cared about their sons. Without Pearl Harbor, Wheeler doesn't retire from the floor in shame. He gets stronger. And in this alternate December, Roosevelt has no answer to him except the abstract moral case for democracy, a case he'd been making for 2 years to diminishing political returns. The German Navy presents a specific and underappreciated opportunity in this counterfactual. Throughout the autumn of 1941, German U-boats had been conducting operations in the Western Atlantic that came increasingly close to direct engagements with American vessels. The USS Kearny, an American destroyer, was torpedoed on the 17th of October, 1941. 11 American sailors died, and Roosevelt used it in a radio address to declare that America has been attacked. The address moved public opinion by several percentage points, but not across the threshold of a declaration of war. The USS Reuben James sunk on the 31st of October, 1941, with the loss of 115 men, moved it further, but still not far enough. In our alternate timeline, these incidents continue accumulating. But accumulation isn't the same as detonation. The American public, in the consistent finding of Gallup polling through November 1941, distinguished between provocation and obligation. Being attacked wasn't sufficient. Being attacked in a way that made defense impossible to avoid was the threshold, and U-boat incidents in the Atlantic hadn't crossed it. Roosevelt's domestic political situation compounds the problem. He had won an unprecedented third term in November 1940 with a significant promise. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars. That sentence was still in the air in December 1941. Breaking it required a political cover that Pearl Harbor provided, and no other event in sight was capable of providing. Without the attack, Roosevelt enters 1942 with a military that is growing. He'd signed the Selective Training and Service Act in September 1940, inaugurating the first peacetime draft in American history, registering 16 million men. But an army that has no clear enemy, no clear mission, and no clear congressional mandate to fight anyone. The Army's training budget for fiscal 1942 was $3,200 million. Its manpower was swelling. But manpower isn't strategy, and strategy requires a political direction that the isolationist coalition is actively blocking. What Roosevelt can do, in this alternate 1942, is press Lend-Lease harder within its existing legislative authority. He can accelerate shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union. He can allow American naval vessels more latitude in the Atlantic. He can make his administration's sympathies so transparent that the legal fiction of neutrality becomes a kind of dark comedy. But he cannot cross the threshold that Pearl Harbor crossed in a single morning. The moment of that threshold, 31 sentences, 1 minute of radio time, was a rupture. Without it, the alternative is erosion, slow, grinding, politically contested erosion of the isolationist wall, brick by brick, over months or years. And during those months or years, the consequences accumulate in Africa and in Russia and in occupied Poland, in ways that the people accumulating them can't stop, and the people tracking them in Washington can't fully see. There's a detail in the Roosevelt archives at Hyde Park that I've thought about since I first read the memo collection from November 1941. It's a note from Harry Hopkins, Roosevelt's closest advisor, the man who'd gone to London to assess Churchill's staying power in January 1941, dated the 24th of November, 1941, 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor. Hopkins writes, "The President believes the German situation on the Eastern Front is changing faster than expected. He does not think we have until spring. He does not think we have until spring." That sentence, written in a White House memo 11 days before Pearl Harbor, solved the problem. Tells you everything about Roosevelt's strategic desperation. He could see what was coming. He could see what was needed. He couldn't find the mechanism to provide it. In our alternate timeline, Hopkins might write the same memo in November 1942 and in November 1943, and never receive the answer that Pearl Harbor delivered in a single murderous morning. The long shadow of this chapter isn't really about Roosevelt's political calculus or Wheeler's Senate floor speeches or Vandenberg's isolationist diary entries. It's about what happens to democracies when catastrophe is the only politically permissible trigger for necessary action. The United States in 1941 needed to enter the war. The structures of its democratic system, public opinion, Senate confirmation, neutrality acts, the memory of the last war, made it impossible to do so without an act so egregious it overwhelmed all the ordinary mechanisms of reluctance. Pearl Harbor was that act. Without it, the democratic machinery functions exactly as designed, deliberate, contested, slow. And in a world where the cost of slowness is measured in the supply manifests of the Africa Corps and the body counts at Stalingrad, the machinery's deliberateness is not an abstract virtue. It's an arithmetic of absence. There's a page in the Vandenberg archive at the University of Michigan's Bentley Historical Library where the senator has written, in his own hand, next to a newspaper clipping about Pearl Harbor, "Now I understand." In our alternate, that page is blank. Chapter 16, The World That Never Assembled. In July of 1944, in the real history of the world, delegates from 44 nations arrived at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, a white clapboard resort in the White Mountains, built in 1902, the kind of place where America's wealthy had once summered, and spent 3 weeks redesigning the architecture of the global economy. They established the International Monetary Fund and what would become the World Bank. They pegged exchange rates to the dollar, which was itself pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. They created, in effect, the economic skeleton on which the post-war Western world would be built. 44 nations sent delegations. Britain's was led by John Maynard Keynes, visibly ill, arguing brilliantly for a more flexible system and losing on most of the details to the American position, which was that the dollar should be the world's reserve currency because America had most of the world's gold, and was the only major economy to emerge from the war physically undamaged. That last fact, the physical undamage, is only true in the real war. In our alternate, it's more complicated. The Bretton Woods Conference requires American belligerency to have its particular form. Without Pearl Harbor, the United States doesn't fully enter the war. Without full entry, the American economy doesn't convert to war production at the scale and speed it actually did. In the real war, American GDP grew from approximately $1 trillion in 1940, in today's terms, to over $2 trillion by 1944, a near doubling driven by military production that absorbed the remaining unemployment of the Great Depression and created the industrial base that made the dollar the world's uncontested reserve asset. Without full belligerency, that conversion is partial. American manufacturing is significant, but not all-consuming. The unemployment rate, still running at 14% as late as 1940, not the commonly cited lower figures, doesn't fully collapse under war mobilization. The American economy is stronger than anyone else's, yes, but it isn't as overwhelmingly dominant in the post-war world as it was in the world that actually emerged from the war. The Bretton Woods Conference, if it happens at all without American full entry, negotiates a different settlement. Keynes might win more of his arguments. The United Nations Charter, signed in San Francisco on the 26th of June, 1945, in reality required the combination of Soviet cooperation, purchased by American diplomacy and lend-lease during a common war, and American institutional will to create the security architecture of the post-war world. Without that combination, without the specific convergence of Soviet-American wartime cooperation that began in June 1941 and deepened through the subsequent years of shared fighting, the San Francisco Conference doesn't happen in its actual form. What might emerge instead is a British-led Commonwealth security system, or a continuation of the failed League of Nations institutional descendants, or, perhaps most likely, regional security agreements with no overarching framework and no Security Council with enforcement authority. The world gets smaller, more fragmented, more like the interwar period it failed to transcend. That's not a minor institutional detail. Every subsequent international crisis, the Korean War, the Suez Crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, was managed within a framework that only exists because American full belligerence in World War II created the conditions for its assembly. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, is one of the most consequential pieces of domestic legislation in American history, and it only exists in its actual form because of the war's actual scale. 8 million American veterans used its educational provisions, driving the most dramatic expansion of higher education in any country in any era. Approximately 40% of American males in the relevant age cohort attended college between 1945 and 1952 under its benefits, transforming the demographic profile of the professional and technical workforce. The bill also provided guaranteed mortgages that created the suburban housing boom of the 1950s, and unemployment benefits that smoothed the reconversion from war to peacetime economy. Without full American belligerence, without 15 million Americans in uniform, the constituency for the GI Bill is smaller, the political pressure for its passage weaker, and its provisions correspondingly more modest. The suburban America that emerged from the post-war years, the middle-class home ownership rate, the college-educated workforce that drove post-war technological growth, all of it is contingent on a specific mobilization scale that only Pearl Harbor made politically possible. The nuclear question is perhaps the most technically vertiginous element of this alternate timeline, and it requires careful handling to avoid melodrama. The Manhattan Project formally began on the 17th of June, 1942, when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers took over atomic weapons development from the civilian S-1 Committee. The S-1 Committee's first meeting after restructuring was the 18th of December, 1941, 11 days after Pearl Harbor, and at that meeting, Ernest Lawrence requested $400,000 for electromagnetic separation work that was immediately approved. The urgency of that approval is inseparable from the political moment. Pearl Harbor had happened. The country was at war. The pre-war caution and budget constraint that had governed atomic research since the Einstein-Szilard letter of August 1939 evaporated in a week. Without Pearl Harbor, the budget request of December 1941 faces the same congressional skepticism that had slowed every previous step. The S-1 Committee exists, the physics is known, but the funding doesn't come with the same political automaticity. The project delays by months. Months accumulate into a year. The bomb, in our alternate, is probably ready in 1947 rather than 1945. A bomb ready in 1947 means several things that are easy to list and very hard to fully comprehend. Germany, in the alternate timeline, has probably already surrendered. Even without American intervention, the industrial weight of the Soviet Union and the strategic bombing campaign of Britain was ultimately sufficient to defeat the Wehrmacht, though the timeline extends and the cost rises. The target, therefore, isn't a German nuclear program racing against the Americans. The target, if any target at all, is what remains of the Pacific conflict. In our alternate, a Pacific conflict that has been grinding along since the Japanese seizure of British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies in early 1942. A conflict in which the United States has been a participant only in the sense of supplying arms and intelligence to Britain, not committing its own forces. A bomb in 1947 lands in a different strategic and moral landscape than the bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Whether it would be used is a question this documentary cannot answer, because it's a question about the moral psychology of governments under conditions that never existed. The Korean Peninsula, divided at the 38th parallel in the real history as an administrative convenience in August 1945, is a product of the specific geopolitical settlement that followed American full participation in the Pacific War. In our alternate timeline, the Soviet Union still enters the Pacific War against Japan in its final weeks, as Stalin had promised Roosevelt at Yalta. But without American forces dominating the Pacific, the Soviet advance into Korea and Manchuria faces no corresponding American counterweight. The division at the 38th parallel was only possible because there were American forces nearby to occupy the southern half. Without them, the entire peninsula potentially falls within the Soviet sphere. The Korean War, as it actually happened, 22 countries under a United Nations flag fighting from June 1950, probably doesn't occur, or occurs in a form unrecognizable to its actual participants. The 36,000 Americans who died in that war belong, in our alternate, to a different casualty register, in a different conflict, or no conflict at all. The Interstate Highway System, authorized by the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, and popularly associated with Eisenhower's presidency, was explicitly modeled on the German Autobahn system that Eisenhower had observed during the liberation of Germany in 1945. Eisenhower's experience commanding Allied forces in Europe, his observation of German military logistics, his conviction that the United States needed a national highway network capable of moving military forces. All of it is contingent on his role in the actual war. Without Pearl Harbor, Eisenhower remains a colonel of the Third Army's War Plans Division, doing serious and important work, but not commanding multinational forces, not observing the Autobahn, not developing the strategic and institutional vision that made him first a five-star general and then a president whose signature domestic achievement was reshaping how Americans moved across their own country. The Eisenhower who doesn't command in Europe may still become president. He's a capable man. But the presidency he brings to the White House is different, and the highway system it produces, if it produces one at all in the 1950s, is designed by different hands, with different models, shaped by different lessons. I've been assembling these institutional counterfactuals for several years, and what strikes me most isn't their individual weight, but their interdependence. The GI Bill creates the college graduates who staff the State Department that funds the Marshall Plan, that rebuilds Europe into the economic partner that sustains the Bretton Woods system. Each element requires all the others. The real post-war world wasn't an accident. It was a specific and deliberate construction, built during the war by people who were simultaneously fighting it and planning what came after. Without the specific scale and character of American participation that Pearl Harbor made possible, the construction has different blueprints, different architects, different materials. Some of what emerges might be better: a Keynesian international monetary system, a less dollar-centric global economy, less American military adventurism in the ensuing decades. Some of it is certainly worse: less nuclear deterrence, less institutional multilateralism, a slower recovery for a devastated Europe. The net assessment is genuinely ambiguous, which is not the same as saying it doesn't matter. It matters enormously, in all directions at once. There is, in the National Archives in Washington, a draft of the United Nations Charter dated the 22nd of April, 1945, about 2 months before the final document was signed. Someone in the State Department has written in the margin, next to Article 1, "This will only work if the United States means it." They didn't sign their name. The sentence is professionally cautious in its hedging. Will only work, not will work, not won't work. And it points to something this documentary has been circling since Chapter 1. The institutions that emerged from the Second World War were built on a specific American seriousness of purpose that was itself built on a specific American experience of catastrophic surprise. Pearl Harbor didn't just bring the United States into a war. It produced, in the American national psyche, a posture toward international engagement that shaped every institution that posture subsequently created. In our alternate world, without that shock, the posture is different, less urgent, more contested. And the marginal note in the draft charter reads, not as a warning, but as a question that has never been tested. Some questions, it turns out, you can only answer by being attacked. Chapter 17. The Lesson of the Pencil Smear. There is a document in the Japanese Defense Ministry archives in Tokyo, Boeicho Archive, reference shelf 6, file 4-1-47, that researchers who study the origins of the Pacific War encounter only rarely, because it isn't remarkable in any obvious way. It's a planning worksheet from the Naval General Staff, dated the 3rd of September, 1941, and it summarizes Japan's strategic options in the event that the oil situation forces a decision for war. It lists 3 columns: Southern option, Northern option, and Hawaii option. The Hawaii option has a note written in the margin, in pencil, in what archivists believe is the handwriting of a Naval General Staff operations planner, whose identity has never been confirmed. The note reads, reckless, not viable or risky or uncertain, reckless. Someone in the Naval General Staff, 6 months before the attack, wrote that word, and then, as the archival scan shows clearly, partially erased it. The smear of the erasure is still visible. The word is gone, but its ghost remains. That partial erasure is, to me, the most precise image of the entire history we've spent 17 chapters examining. The history of the Pacific War's origins is a history of things that were almost stopped, almost reconsidered, almost prevented by the very people setting them in motion. Admiral Yamamoto almost stopped the Pearl Harbor plan himself, calling it a gamble in his January 7, 1941 letter to Navy Minister Oikawa, a letter in which he outlined the operational concept, while simultaneously warning that striking the United States would be opening a war with no prospect of success. The modus vivendi that Secretary Hull drafted in late November 1941 and then withdrew under pressure from Chiang Kai-shek and Churchill represented a 90-day pause that might have changed everything. Saburo Kurusu, the special envoy who flew from Tokyo to Washington via Clipper in November 1941, arrived with a genuine, if structurally limited mandate to find a settlement. Each of these near misses is documented. Each has its own archival footprint. And each reminds us that the Pacific War was not a historical inevitability, grinding forward on unstoppable tracks, but a sequence of human decisions, each one contingent, each one made by individuals under constraint, who could, in principle, have decided differently. This is where the historiography of 1941 becomes genuinely contentious, and where scholars part company in ways that matter for how we understand our alternate scenario. The structuralist school, represented by scholars like Akira Irie and John Dower, argues that the geopolitical and economic forces at work in 1941 were so powerful that some form of Pacific conflict was effectively inevitable, regardless of the specific trigger. Japan's expansion into China, the American oil embargo, the structural incompatibility of Japanese imperial ambition and American Pacific interests, these forces would have produced a collision even without the specific form Pearl Harbor took. The contingency school, represented by scholars like Herbert Feiss and Jonathan Utley, argues that the specific decisions of the final months of 1941 were genuinely open, that different individuals in different positions could have produced different outcomes, and that the war was not written into the structure of the situation before it happened. Our 17 chapters have implicitly been arguing something between these positions, that the structural forces made conflict very likely, but that the specific form Pearl Harbor took, the December 7th attack, the massive shock, the morning of infamy, was not inevitable, and that its absence would have changed the shape of what followed, in ways both calculable and not. The oil arithmetic is the closest thing this series has to a fixed point. Japan's reserves of approximately 50 million barrels in early 1941, declining at a naval consumption rate of roughly 70,000 barrels per day, 2,900 barrels per hour, as the DTIC's Pacific Oil Logistics Study documents, defined a hard deadline. Without a resolution to the oil crisis by mid-1942 at the latest, Japan faced military paralysis. The Dutch East Indies fields produced 65 million barrels annually in their pre-war output, which was more than sufficient for Japan's needs of 5 million tons per year. But the captured fields operated at only 60% of previous output due to Dutch sabotage, and Japan's merchant tanker fleet of 49 vessels, totaling 587,000 tons, was structurally inadequate to move that oil efficiently. The oil problem that drove Japan to war in the South was not, therefore, fully solved by the Southern strategy. It was ameliorated. In our alternate where Japan seizes the Dutch East Indies without attacking Pearl Harbor, the oil problem persists, feeding strategic instability, feeding internal political pressures in Tokyo, feeding the kind of institutional recklessness that produces the word reckless penciled in margins. The structural pressure doesn't release, it finds a different valve. The moral accounting of this counterfactual is something I've resisted through most of this series, because moral accounting in alternate history tends toward a particular kind of false precision, tabulating lives saved and lives lost in a scenario that never happened, with a confidence the evidence doesn't support. But the moral weight has to be named, even without the false precision. In the real war, the Pearl Harbor attack and its consequences killed approximately 85 million people total, including military and civilian dead across all theaters, by most comprehensive estimates. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor killed 2,403 Americans and wounded approximately 1,200 more. The question our series has been building toward, implicitly, consistently, is whether those 2,400 Americans and the political and institutional cascade their deaths triggered were the necessary condition for everything that followed. The answer, uncomfortable as it is to hold, is yes, and also no. Yes, because without Pearl Harbor, America doesn't fully enter the war in December 1941, and the war's shape and timeline and institutional aftermath change materially. No, because the claim that Pearl Harbor needed to happen in order for the good things of the post-war world to exist is a kind of retrospective instrumentalization of specific deaths that those people didn't consent to and didn't choose. The strategic lessons that the United States drew from Pearl Harbor, surprise as a mortal vulnerability, intelligence integration as a strategic imperative, the need for unified command structures, became the institutional vocabulary of American national security for the rest of the 20th century. The National Security Act of 1947, which created the CIA, the National Security Council, and the Unified Department of Defense, was explicitly written in response to the perceived failures of the intelligence and command structures that allowed Pearl Harbor to happen. Without Pearl Harbor, there is no NSC in its 1947 form, no CIA with its specific mandate, no unified command plan governing the relationship between the service branches. What emerges instead might be better or worse, more or less prone to the specific pathologies that the actual NSC and CIA developed, but it emerges from different soil, shaped by different failures. The SIGINT revolution, the satellite intelligence systems, the doctrines of information dominance that define American military thought in the 21st century, all trace a direct institutional lineage back to a morning in December 1941 and the specific shock of what wasn't known in time. In our own present, in 2026, the echoes of Pearl Harbor's consequences are still structurally audible. The United States maintains military installations in Japan, South Korea, Guam, and the Philippines. Installations whose presence is a direct product of the Pacific War's outcome and the post-war security arrangements it produced. The alliance with Japan, formalized in the 1951 Security Treaty and continuously renewed since, is one of the most stable and consequential bilateral security relationships in the world. In our alternate timeline, without American full belligerence in the Pacific, without the American occupation of Japan that followed its defeat, without the MacArthur-era constitutional and institutional redesign of Japanese society, the relationship between the United States and Japan would be fundamentally different. And the contemporary Indo-Pacific security architecture, which depends on American-Japanese alliance as its keystone, simply doesn't exist in its actual form. The geopolitical consequences reach from the Taiwan Strait to the Korean Peninsula to the South China Sea, in ways that analysts and strategists are still actively trying to map. The document that comes back to me at the end of this series isn't the Yamamoto letter of January 7, 1941. It isn't the Morgenthau Diary, or the Hull Note, or Caruso's diplomatic cables, or Lindbergh's Madison Square Garden speeches. It's the partial erasure on the Naval General Staff Planning Worksheet, the ghost of the word reckless, that someone tried to remove and couldn't quite. That smears the Kharkiv gets to ambivalence, to a human being, inside the machinery of a decision that would reshape the world, reaching for a different word and then thinking better of it, or thinking worse of it. We don't know which. We don't know if the erasure was the act of the person who wrote it, or someone who read it after. We don't know if removing the word meant, this plan is not reckless, or this plan is reckless and we should say something less alarming. Archives give you the residue of decisions, but not the interior of the deciding. That gap between what the evidence shows and what actually moved inside the human beings who made the choices is where all alternate history lives, and where honest historical inquiry is perpetually, productively uncomfortable. There is a version of this story in which Japan never attacks Pearl Harbor, and the world is better. Fewer people die sooner. The long agony of the Pacific island hopping campaign is avoided. The bombs don't fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Cold War's Asian dimension takes a different shape. There is an equally plausible version in which Japan never attacks Pearl Harbor, and the world is considerably worse. Germany fights a longer war, with fewer constraints. The Holocaust machinery operates in more countries for more years. The Soviet Union is more damaged by the absence of full American support, and emerges weaker and more paranoid from a longer conflict. The post-war institutional architecture is weaker or absent, and the 20th century's second half is more violent and less ordered than it actually was. The historical truth is that both versions contain real weight, and neither cancels the other out. The quality of historical thinking isn't in choosing between them. It's in holding both at once and refusing the comfort of resolution. The last thing I want to say is about that cleaned-up planning worksheet and the word underneath the smear. What we know from the series of decisions that actually followed is that the word reckless was, whether or not it stayed on the page, ultimately ignored. Yamamoto's plan was approved. The carriers sailed. The morning of December 7th arrived, and the world that followed was built on that specific catastrophe, with all its specific costs and all its specific contingent achievements. What the counterfactual teaches us, what 17 chapters of trying to think clearly about a world that didn't happen have taught me, is not that Pearl Harbor was secretly good or secretly necessary. It's that the world we inhabit was made by specific, particular, reversible decisions made by specific, particular human beings who could have decided otherwise. That's not comforting. It shouldn't be. It means the weight of what came next, the war, the dead, the institutions, the bombs, the alliance structures, the interstate highways, the Security Council, the GI Bill, the smear on the worksheet, belongs to no impersonal force and no divine plan. It belongs to the people who made the decisions, and to us in how we remember what they decided. There's one more detail. The Naval General Staff Planning Worksheet, reference shelf 6, file 4-1-47, carries a routing stamp indicating it was reviewed by at least 3 senior officers before it was filed. The stamp dates are legible, the 3rd, the 9th, and the 18th of September, 1941. 3 separate human beings held that paper, and the word underneath the smear. None of them, in the end, said stop. The log entry for the 18th reads simply, reviewed, no action required. The archivist who digitized the file in 2009 has noted, in the finding aid, that the routing slips are intact, but the names of the reviewing officers are illegible due to water damage. We don't know who they were. We know what they chose. We're still living inside it. The deepest division among historians of the Pacific War's origins runs between structuralists like Akira Irie, who argue that the oil embargo and Japan's imperial trajectory made conflict effectively inevitable, regardless of specific decisions, and contingency scholars like Jonathan Utley and Herbert Feiss, who maintain that the Hull Note's hard line in November 1941 was a specific policy choice that closed off viable alternatives. This debate isn't purely academic. It determines how much agency historical actors had, and therefore how much their alternate choices could have mattered. The question of how much Washington knew before December 7, 1941, remains contested. Robert Stinnett's Day of Deceit argues that Roosevelt's administration had extensive foreknowledge and deliberately withheld warnings to allow the attack to proceed. David Kahn and Gordon Prange's more mainstream scholarship establishes that purple decrypts, the highest-level diplomatic intercepts, gave Washington ample warning of Japan's intention to break off negotiations, but not of Pearl Harbor as the specific target. The distinction matters enormously for evaluating Roosevelt's moral responsibility and for understanding the alternate scenario where diplomatic resolution might have been possible. The relative contribution of American Lend-Lease to Soviet military success is a contested historiographical question with political dimensions that persist to the present. Soviet-era scholarship systematically minimized American contributions. Post-Soviet scholarship, using newly available archival sources, has generally increased the estimated importance of Lend-Lease, particularly the trucks, the aviation fuel, and the food supplies that freed Soviet workers for weapons production. Marshal Zhukov's suppressed memoir passages and Khrushchev's later recollections both acknowledge American material was decisive. This debate bears directly on the alternate scenario's assessment of what the Soviet Union could have achieved without full American belligerency.